I took the North Sector because nobody else wanted to in late October. That wasn't official, obviously. On the rota, it was just another boundary patrol, the same as the others, but there was always a reason certain stretches got handed off without argument. South Loop had the scenic pullouts, the family campers, the easy lost hiker callouts where a college kid wandered half a mile off the trail trying to get a better photo and ended up crying by sunset. The west side had the river crossings, the drunk fishermen. Black Pine had almost nothing, and somewhat that made it worse. It had an old service road, dead radio pockets, and a reputation that every ranger pretended not to believe in while quietly avoiding solo patrols after dark. I was 27, seasonal, and stupid in very specific way that young men can be that have just had enough training to think that the competence makes them untouchable. I had 2 summers of search and rescue under my belt, a decent field record, and that dangerous kind of confidence that comes from having already seen a few bad things and deciding that you understand how the world works. Missing people, injuries, exposure, animal encounters. I had a mental category for all of it. Everything fit somewhere. Panic had patterns. Wilderness accidents had causes. Even grief, after a while, develops a familiar shape. Black Pine Bridge did not. On the map, the area's ordinary enough. A long rise of timber and granite shelves running along the northern boundary of the park, cut by narrow drainage and old logging scars reclaimed by dense pine. There were no big viewpoints, no famous lakes, no marked attractions that would draw normal visitors. The trail system there had been thinned down after storm damage and budget cuts, just leaving one maintenance route and a handful of ghost paths that appeared on older maps but not the current public ones. The old route still existed in pieces. You'd find sections of trail cut into the slope, rotting signposts swallowed by bark, and lengths of warped boardwalk ended in nothing but swamp grass and deadfall. It was a sort of terrain that tricks people. It looks reliable from a distance. Once you step onto it, every direction becomes the same. By then, I'd already heard the stories, though nobody in the office called them that. They come out sideways in conversation, wrapped in jokes or half-finished memories. A volunteer mentioning that batteries dried up faster there. An old ranger saying not to trust the voices that you heard at night, because ridgelines threw strange sounds. A maintenance guy swore that on one of the trail cameras he kept capturing a light moving through the trees where there was no road, and no one ever logged a vehicle. One woman in dispatch asked one morning if I was on the North Sector again. I said yes. She hesitated in a way that made me look up from my coffee. She kept telling me to keep checking in on time, even if nothing happened. She said it lightly, but it was enough with weight under her voice that I noticed it. I laughed and said, "Well, is the Black Pine Ridge haunted?" She said no. I think people get turned around there. It sounded like the safe answer, the answer you give when there's enough answer underneath it that you don't want to say aloud what the truth is. They call him just after 43 minutes on a Thursday, with the kind of grey light that makes afternoon feel like evening. A couple from Idaho reported their son missing from the Raven Spur trailhead near the northern boundary. 22. Name, Colin Beach. According to his parents, he'd gone out at noon to do a short hiking trip alone while they drove around looking for a scenic overlook further south. They were supposed to meet back on the trailhead at 3. At 33, he still wasn't there. They then waited another 30 minutes, called his phone repeatedly, flagging down a volunteer host to a campground kiosk who relayed in. That part wasn't unusual. People underestimated distances all the time, especially in shoulder season when the cold came fast and dark arrived early when they expected it. Now, What made me pay attention was the location. Raven Spur was the maintained trail, yes, but the old feeder routes off it were the exact sort of thing that an adventurous kid who wandered onto for what he believed was a better view, a shortcut, or the feeling of finding something abandoned. If he stepped off and lost the main trail with daylight already going, we have a problem. By 5:15, we had a search coordinated, and 2 rangers were heading in from the south, 1 volunteer team mobilizing, and me taking the first hasty search from the north access road because I was closest. Standard practice. Move fast while there's still a chance that the subject is ambulatory and responsive. Check the obvious errors first: trail junctions, water sources, shelter points, places that a confused person might drift to naturally. I parked at the trailhead before 6. The parents were besides a silver SUV, standing too still in the way that families do when they're trying not to unravel in front of a uniformed person. The father was fixed, over-controlled. Now, I always distrusted it because it meant that the emotion was going somewhere else. The mother was pale and shaking, but speaking clearly. She showed me a photo of Colin on her phone. He has a slim build, dark hair, green jacket and baseball cap. The kind of face that still looked younger than 22, unless he tried not to. She said he wasn't reckless. She said he hiked. She said he knew better than to go too far. Most people say that. It usually means that the missing person knew just enough to get into trouble confidently. I asked what he had with him, and she said a small backpack, water bottle, protein bars, hoodie, phone, no overnight gear, no headlamp that they knew of. I asked if he mentioned any plans before going on to the main trail. The father hesitated and said that he liked old places, fire roads, ruins, anything creepy or historical. He half smiled as he said the word, as though embarrassed by it. The smile then disappeared when I asked if Colin had said anything specific. The father looked towards a tree line and he asked if there was an old ranger station out here. I remembered the cold that moved through me then, not fear, just a sense of a shape beginning to emerge from pieces, like I know they don't fit together. There had been a station in the North Sector once, a small seasonal outpost built in the 70s, used for fire watch and boundary patrol, then shut down after some storm damage made the access road unreliable. Most of it had been demolished in the 90s, but there were still foundations, scraps of fencing, and a storage shed lower down the ridge that officially didn't exist for public purposes because nobody wanted tourists trying to find it. The locals called the whole area Black Pine Station, even though there was almost nothing left. I asked where he heard about it. The mother said that he read something online, maybe an old forum, maybe a hiking post. She didn't know. I didn't tell them what I was thinking. I just took the photo and got his number and headed into the trail. The first mile was easy hiking, packed turf, wet needles, and few exposure routes, slick from the recent rain. Dusk had flattened the colour out of everything. The pine needles were almost black, and the few remaining birch leaves looked like scraps of paper caught in the branches. I call Colin's name every few minutes. I used to whistle in a sequence. I stopped to listen often, but at first I only heard ordinary sounds. Wind moving high in the canopy, boots rustling on the ground cover, and the occasional crack from cooling timber. Then maybe 20 minutes in, I heard something further up the hill that made me stop. It sounded like a whistle, then short blasts, then like owls. I turned towards the slope, listened hard, nothing. Then after maybe 15 seconds, the pattern comes again, fainter this time, drifting through the trees further north. That should have been encouraging. Search and rescuers find that people being rescued mimic their sounds back to you. People hear your whistle and answer with what they have. But something felt off about this, not the sound itself. It was very measured, too measured and even, with the exact spacing that I'd been trained to use. Most untrained people answer in messy bursts, but this one sounded too practiced. I call out Colin, "This is Ranger Ellis. Call me if you hear me." No reply. I left the main trail and start uphill. The slope there was steep, with loose granite under the needles. 20 yards in, I found a partial print in the mud near a deadfall, boot tread, recent, size maybe 10 or 11. Could have been Colin, could have been anybody from last week. Another 30 yards up, I found a snapped branch at shoulder height, and the kind of disturbed ground that suggests a fast descent or panicked climb. Nothing conclusive, but enough to keep me moving. I radio in the direction of travel and possible sign. Dispatch acknowledges, though the transmission came back with the fuzzy clipping you get in weak coverage. I kept hearing the whistle, always ahead of me, always just far enough that I had to keep pushing. At one point, I stopped and I realized that I had not heard any normal wildlife for several minutes. No squirrel chatter, no wing beat from disturbed birds, nothing. Just wind, and the whistle, and my own breathing. I remembered thinking that the forest felt padded somehow, like sound is being absorbed. I've tried to explain that sensation since, and it always comes out wrong. It wasn't silent exactly. It was the absence of the little confirming noises that tell you the woods still behave like woods. I searched the remains of an old service cut as the last useful light was dying. It was one of the forgotten paths from the pre-GPS days, a narrow corridor through the trees choked with young growth and down branches. The kind of place that you wouldn't see unless you were almost on top of it. Somebody had walked through recently enough that a few dead few have fallen in ferns. I crouched with my flashlight and found a clear print in the mud. Varabium sole, fresh, angled north, deeper on the toes, meaning that the person was going uphill and fast. I radioed in again. I told them that the person has probably started heading towards the old ranger station. There was a pause before dispatch answered. Then Teresa's voice came through instead of the coordinator slightly distorted. Copy. Hold your position if you lose visual and wait for the second team. That wasn't a normal call. In a hasty search, especially with probable sign, you keep pressure on unless conditions become unsafe. I said as much. Then, second team's 10 minutes out. I looked at the sky through the branches. It was already too dark to trust that estimate as anything but paperwork optimism. 10 minutes on a map could mean 30 on that terrain. If Colin was injured and still moving in the wrong direction, we might lose him completely. I answered, "I'm continuing another 100 yards to verify." Teresa didn't respond for a second. When she did, her voice was lower. Do not follow any voice unless you have visual. I actually smiled at that, out of disbelief more than amusement. Then I asked if she was serious, and the radio crackled yes. That was all. I should have turned back. I say that now because that's a sensible thing to do, the professional thing to do. The line that proves I understood that I made a mistake. But the truth is, in that moment, her warning made me more determined to keep going. Though it was superstition wrapped in protocol, the old local fear that bled into search culture. I thought if there was a real hazard, she would have named it plainly: cliff, mineshaft, bear activity, anything concrete. Don't follow any voice unless you have visual sounded like something you tell a rookie to spook him. So I keep on. The old cut narrowed and then bent along the side of a shallow drainage. My flashlight beam caught bits of rusted cable, half buried in moss, a broken trail marker, and one of the old square nails they used before the park modernize the structures. I was close to the station ground. Through the trees, I can't really see much. I call Colin's name again, this time louder. Then something answers from downhill, here. It was a young man's voice, strained and breathless. I swung around so fast that I nearly slipped. The voice had come from behind me, from the way I'd just climbed. It made sense. I hit the light down the slope and saw nothing but trunks and dark brush. The voice come again further now uphill. Hey, over here. Same voice, same panic, different direction. My mouth went dry. There are explanations, I know. Sound can actually behave differently in ridgelines. Cold air layers can carry and bend voices. Stress can actually distort perception. I have repeated every one of those explanations to myself for 2 years. None of them change how it felt standing there, hearing the same voice call from 2 different places in the space of 3 breaths. Now, I keyed the radio and get only static. Not weak signal, not clipped interference, just a thick hissing, wash like open ocean. Then I hear movement ahead. No crashing, not running, just a steady and deliberate tread through wet needles. A person who knew exactly where he was going and didn't care if I heard him. I followed the beam into the trees and finally saw the clearing. What remained of Black Pine Station sat in a shallow bowl between the ridge and the drainage. The main cabin was gone except for a rectangle of foundation stones and one section of wall standing where the chimney had anchored it. The storage shed, however, was still there, leaning, roof half collapsed, door hanging open at an angle. The whole clearing was fringed with tall black pines that seemed to drink the flashlight instead of reflecting it. Old snow fencing lay in tangles near the foundation. A rusted barrel had split on one side. It looked exactly like the sort of abandoned place a curious kid would go exploring near sunset. What made me stop was a backpack. It lay in the center of the clearing, upright as though somebody set it there carefully. I approached slowly, scanning all around. There's no movement, no sound. I crouched beside it and saw the pocket still had a water bottle. The zipper's half open. Inside was a hoodie, 2 bars, and a phone with a cracked screen. I pressed the side button, dead. That should have been enough to confirm Colin had been there. Instead, it made everything feel worse. A lost hiker drops things on the move, or leaves them where he stops. He doesn't usually arrange them neatly in the middle of an abandoned clearing and continue into a denser forest terrain without his light, water, or phone. I call his name again. No reply. Then from inside the shed, I heard a single knock. It was soft, like wood tapping. I got my flashlight on the doorway and say, "Colin, if you're in there now, answer me." And there's nothing. I step closer. The shed smelled damp and sour like wet boards and old animal bedding. The shelf had almost collapsed on one wall. There was rusted out fuel cans, mold-eaten tarps, and a line of hand tools hanging from nails so corroded they looked fused to the wood. The beam travelled across the back wall and caught scratches in the board, deep ones, parallel, not recent, from the look of them, but hard enough to gouge through the wood. Then the door moved behind me. Not slammed, just shifted a few inches inward with a groan. I spun around, pulse hammering, and saw only darkness beyond the opening. Wind, I tell myself. An even frame, old hinges. Then a voice spoke from just outside, very quietly. "Don't go back that way." It's Colin's voice. I knew that because I'd listened to a voicemail his mother played me at the trailhead when she was trying to prove what he sounded like. Young, slightly nasal, ordinary. The voice came outside the shed and is calm, almost conversational. Every hair on my arm lifted up. I said, "Colin, step where I can see you." and there's no answer. I edged towards the doorway and brought the flashlight around in a sweep, emptying the clearing. Now, I don't see anything, just trees. Then, from behind the tree line, behind the old cabin, the same voice says he's near you. I backed out of the shed with the radio in one hand, and my hand on the bear spray at my chest. I kept the beam moving. Left, right, foundation, barrel, doorway, tree line. I call out again, louder now, Colin, if that's you, keep talking. The response came from further back in the trees. I tried. That was when I made the first decision I'm ashamed of. I left the backpack where it was and moved towards the voice. Not because I believed it anymore, not exactly, but because some part of my training overrode everything else. Subject located, possibly disorientated. Keep contact, close distance. I told myself if this was a trick of sound, I'd prove it in 20 seconds. If it was actually Colin, I couldn't walk away from him. The ground below the clearing dropped into thicker timber, and boulders furred with moss. The beam kept catching pale scrapes of things that weren't on the second look, broken branches, rock faces, old stumps. 30 feet in, I found another print in a patch of soft ground, same tread, fresh enough that water had not fully seeped into the edges. I followed it to a second print, then a third, all heading down slope in a straight line. The voice calls again. This time it was crying, please don't leave me. I've never heard fear performed so perfectly. This is the only word for it now, performed, not exaggerated, not fake in the obvious sense. It was exactly like somebody fighting panic. Even the breath breaks, the exact swollen edge that makes you think before you act. It was so convincing that my body reacted before my mind could argue with it. I started downhill faster, branches hitting my shoulders, boots slipping on wet needles. Then, my light found the drop. I stopped so hard I nearly pitched over the edge. The ground now fell into a narrow drop, maybe 15 feet deep. Not quite a ravine, more like a crack seamed into the slope, and darkness. Another 3 strides and I would have gone straight into it. My beam shook as I followed the cart left and right. At the bottom lay broken branches, slick stone, and a black pool of water collected at the end. At the far side, half hidden behind a pine, was a person. For one full second I thought I had him. Green jacket, dark cap, slim build. Then the beam hit the face. There was no damage, no blood, no dramatic horror movie wrongness. In some ways that made it worse. The face looks normal but empty, like a person trying to wear an expression. The mouth was slightly open, the eyes reflected bright and flat. It stood with one shoulder angled towards me and one arm tucked closer to its side in a way that people don't really do, unless they've injured themselves. I shout Colin. It smiled. Not wide, just enough. Then it stepped behind a tree and was gone. I hit the radio again, hard enough that my thumb hurt. This time I got fragments, dispatch, maybe, or another ranger. Nothing usable. I shouted across the cut, listened, and heard only wind. When I swung the light down, I found a route around the edge and crossed as quickly as I dared. On the far side, there were prints. Yes, but wrong somehow. Too deep at the forefoot, too narrow in the heel, like somebody wearing boots that didn't fit, or moving in a way that put weight in the wrong places. I followed them 20 yards before they simply stopped on bare needles. No turn, no scuffle, no downslide. Just ended. I stood there, with the light moving in fast jerks, and knew finally that I need to get out of that section and regroup. The voice spoke again. This time to my left, Ranger. Then, from behind me, in a perfect imitation of my own voice, I hear Colin. I don't mind admitting I ran. Not all the way, not blind panic, but I moved uphill fast and without dignity, crashing through brush towards a clearing because open ground suddenly seemed preferable to trees. My breathing sounded huge in my ears. Twice I thought I heard somebody matching pace just out of sight to my right. Once I heard that crying again, closer. A panic is followed by a short laugh that might have been a branch snapping in the cold, except it rose and fell in an unmistakable rhythm of a person trying not to be heard. When I burst back into the clearing, the backpack was gone. The center of the clearing was empty. I stopped dead, turned in a full circle, and saw the backpack now sitting on top of the old foundation wall, balanced neatly on the stones where it had not been before. Something inside the shed moved, a shadow crossing the doorway. That was when my radio finally cleared and I hear Teresa's voice snapped through loud enough to make me flinch. "Ellis, respond now." I answer instantly, louder than necessary, and nearly shout my location. She cut me off and asked one question. "Are you in the clearing?" I said yeah. She told me to leave immediately and return to the trail without going downhill, without entering the shed again, and without responding to any voice unless I had visual contact with a known team member. Her tone left no room for argument. For the first time that night, I obeyed without thinking. I started back the way I'd come, flashlight low, head turning constantly. At the edge of the clearing, I looked back once more. I wish I hadn't. Something was standing in the shed doorway watching me. The beam caught only the lower half of it before I jerked the light away. Boots, legs, the hem of a green jacket. I got to the old cut and almost collided with two members of the second team coming in from below. Martinez, one of our permanent rangers. Haplin, a volunteer with 10 years on the unit. Relief hit me so hard that my knees went weak. They took one look at my face and stopped asking routine questions. Martinez asked where the subject was. I pointed back towards a clearing and I said I wasn't sure I'd actually seen him. Then the older of the two rangers, Harper, says in a warm voice, "Did you speak to him?" I stared at him. Martinez told him to knock it off, but the words already landed. He didn't look embarrassed, he looked angry as though I did something stupid. I told them about the backpack, the voice, the figure that I had seen. I left out the part about hearing my own voice because I knew how it sounded. Martinez listened, jaw clenched, then said, "We are pulling back to the trail and re-establishing command before re-entering with more personnel. Good call. Textbook." Now, as we turned to go, a whistle sounded from the clearing. Some short blasts, 3, then another, answering from further up the ridge, then another further away. The three of us stopped without meaning to. A third whistle came from the darkness downhill. This time, it's beyond where any of our people should have been. I get warned quickly to move, and we do. Back at the trailhead, command had expanded. More vehicles, more lights. 2 deputies from the county. Colin's parents still there, though somebody had them sitting in the back of a warm truck now. I gave my statement, as much of it as I could without sounding insane or incompetent. I expected Martinez to trim the strange parts out when he relayed it upwards. Instead, he backed me on almost everything except the face. He said that we had probable subject sign at Black Pine Station, auditory anomalies and train hazards severe enough to justify a contained night search with perimeter teams. Auditory anomalies was a phrase he uses. Nobody laughs. That changed the whole feeling of the operation. Searches usually run on momentum, clear signs, assignments, check-ins, movements, maps, patterns. This one developed a strange hesitation around the edges. People kept glancing north. Radios we checked more often than we would have normally. Nobody volunteered for solo insertion. Even the deputies, who treat the park stories as local superstition, look unsettled once they heard the area name. One of them asked me to the side if I was sure that the kid had really gone towards the old station. I said I was sure enough to keep people focused on there. He nodded. Then, he'd been on a call near that ridge 6 years earlier, a legal hunting camp. He said that they'd found a tree with strips of fluorescent survey tape tied around it in knots. No survey crew had been logged in the area for months. He didn't explain why that mattered, he just offered it and kept walking away. We went back at 8:30 with 6 searchers, tighter comms, and orders to hold visual contact wherever possible. I was paired with Martinez. Harplin took point to the old cut because he knew the ground better. Clearing looked much better with lights on it, less supernatural, more ruined, but the feeling returned the moment we stepped into it. The air was cooler there, not by much, but maybe a few degrees, but enough that everybody notices. Our lights covered over the foundation, the barrel of the shed. The backpack was back in the center of the clearing, exactly where I'd seen it. Nobody said anything for a second. Martinez asked if anybody had touched it since first contact, but nobody had. He approached, photographed it, gloved up, and opened one of the main compartments. Same contents, same dead phone. This time, there was one extra item inside, which is a folded piece of paper. It was damp from the condensation. He handed it to me because I had the parent statement. It was torn from a small notebook. Across the front in a shaky pen was a single sentence. He keeps calling from the trees. Nobody noticed it, but the handwriting looked off. Martinez bagged the note. The coordinator, standing off to one side with a map, started reorganizing the assessment right there. The search had changed again. This was no longer a likely overdue hiker. This was a distressed subject, possibly injured, possibly hiding, possibly in the grip of severe panic, enough that he's abandoned his gear and wrote the sentence before going off further into the dark. We searched outwards from the clearing in sectors. Standard procedure, slow, methodical, overlapping beans, frequent check-ins. For the first 15 minutes we get nothing. Then, Team 2 actually found fabric on a branch downslope, a thread of green nylon caught on bark, then another 40 yards on, a smear on a stone that looked dark in the flashlight but later proved to be blood. Not much, just enough to say that he'd probably taken a fall or scraped against something sharp. We marked the spot and pushed further. At 9:20, one of the deputies radioed that he heard movement paralleling them uphill. At 9:30, he clarified that he could also hear movement downhill at the same pace. At 9:14, his partner said there was a light through the trees to their east, like a phone screen or small flashlight. No team was assigned east. Martinez asked for visual confirmation and gets none. We all froze into listening. That's a dangerous thing in a search. Once uncertainty enters, noise multiply. Every branch falls and everything becomes a footstep. Every patch of pale legend becomes a farce. Our lights keep on crossing each other through the trees, casting impressions of motion where none existed. I remember the smell of wet pine, my own breath inside the collar, and the very clear sensation that there were more people on the slope than we've actually accounted for. Then somebody screamed. Real fear doesn't sound cinematic, it sounds abrupt and ugly, as if the body had no time to prepare. The scream came from the team's 2 side of the line. We all move at once, breaking formation and converging downhill, branches whiffing my face, a flashlight beam flashed white through the trunks and vanishing. When we reached them, Deputy Slolan was on the ground beside a boulder, trying to stand while his partner half hauled him up by the vest. He said something grabbed his ankle. We all lit the area. There's nothing there except for roots, rocks, and a narrow hole under the boulder where the runoff had eroded soil away. Too small for a man, but large enough for an arm if you want to imagine one. Sloane insisted it wasn't a root. He said it had fingers. He said it tugged once and hard. Nobody contradicted him, but nobody confirmed it either. Then Harper called from 30 yards away that he found a body. Everything seems to stop. We climbed towards his light and found him standing at the edge of another rock seam, narrower than the first one that I'd nearly fallen into. At the bottom lay a person in a green jacket. For a second, my entire body turned to ice. Then Harper said, "Not him." The person below was older, broader in the shoulders, beard gone white, and sparse along the jaw. What remained of the face was enough to tell us that death was not fresh. Animal damage and weather had done their work. Clothing was layered and old-fashioned for backcountry recreation, worn canvas under the jacket. One boot was missing. The other still clung to a foot, twisted at an impossible angle. County called it in. We secured the scene the best we can and widened our lights. A second search boundary around the body found a rusted revolver, empty, a belt knife driven point first in a log hard enough that the hilt had weathered into the wood. In one pocket, there was a wallet reduced almost to pulp. Later, with careful drying and processing, they get enough from the contents to identify him as Warren Pike, a hunter reported missing 8 years earlier from land just outside of the park boundary. He vanished during elk season after telling friends that he knew a shortcut through the north sector. That discovery should have reset the whole search. It should have made everything else secondary until investigators could process the remains. But Colin was still missing, likely alive. And now, we had a night operation split between active rescue and death scene in terrain that already had people spooked. The coordinator pulled us back into the clearing to regroup, and so that we can rotate fresh personnel in. When we got there, Colin's phone was ringing. Dead screen, dead battery, evidence bag and all, sitting on the hood of a truck at the Trailhead Perimeter checkpoint where it had been transported earlier ringing. I did not see that personally, but 3 people swore to it independently and called in tracer. The call showed no caller ID, only a white interface before the phone died again. Nobody answered it in time. The note, meanwhile, had been sent down to the base with the evidence runner. When it was unfolded a second time, under proper light, there was writing on the back no one had noticed in the clearing. It read, "If you hear me, it's not me." That line spread through the search team in under 10 minutes. No one admitted passing it. Everybody heard it anyway. We should have suspended until daylight. I believe that now. But searches are driven by survivability windows, and a young man in autumn cold with no overnight gear does not have the luxury of our comfort. So command kept going until midnight, with reduced movement, tighter discipline, and one new rule issued over to the radio for every searcher in the sector: do not respond to voices requesting help unless you also have visual contact. No one said why. At 10:36, Martinez and I were sweeping the western edge of the station when I found tape. Fluorescent orange survey ribbon, faded almost pink, tied around a sapling at chest height, then another 20 yards beyond it, then another. They led in a loose line away from the clearing, into a stand of tighter timber where trunks grew so close together that the flashlight could barely penetrate through them. I called Martinez over. He muttered something under his breath, and I didn't catch it, and asked who the hell had marked a route out there. No survey crews were scheduled. No trail team had logged work. The tape looked old, but fairly uniform. Some strips were bleached and brittle. Others looked fresh enough to have been tied that week. We followed them because in a search you follow markers. This is yet another decision that I replay. The tape led us maybe 100 yards into the tight stand, then down into a shallow depression ridged by boots. The ground there was softer, almost springy under the needles. It smelt sour, like stagnant water under rot. Our lights found more tape, but now it hung not from saplings alone, but from lower branches at odd heights. Some too high to tie comfortably without reaching, some barely above the ground. The line zigzagged irrationally, doubling back on itself, crossing where no sensible route would. It began to feel much less like a trail and more like the imitation of trail marking by something that had seen the concept but not understood the purpose. Martinez was the one who saw the shoe. It laid buried in the depression, heel up, modern hiking shoe, size about 10, mud-caked but intact, inside a foot. We both recoiled so hard that our beam swung through the trees. Not very cleanly though. This is torn, and old enough that tissue had darkened and stiffened. Animals scavenged, probably. Maybe from Warren Pike, maybe not. Hard to tell in the field. What mattered was the message it sent to the two men, who were already very tired at this point. Now, Martinez radioed in what we found. While spooked, I heard someone whisper my name, very close. I turned around with the flashlight behind me. There was a man standing between two trees about 20 feet away. No green jacket this time, ranger uniform. For one dead, impossible second I thought it was Martinez, until I realized Martinez was still beside me on the radio. The figure had old-style shoulder patches discontinued years before, dark brown shirt, camping hat. His face was shadowy by the brim. He stood with one arm slightly raised as though signalling to be quiet, but I couldn't tell. Then the light caught him fully, and there was no face under the brim at all. Not missing, just dark, as though the shadow had been there with weight. I shouted and Martinez spun around, but the figure's gone. Martinez saw only the trees, but my reaction was enough. He grabbed my arm and said that we're done in that depression. We back out together, not turning our backs until we reach the marked perimeter. Now we get to around 11 and the weather shifted. The wind came down stronger from the ridge, bringing mists that thickened into a cold, needling rain. Visibility dropped. Radio got worse. Searchline shortened. At 11:22, we are now getting radioed by Harper for a missed check-in. At 11:24, another team reported hearing him answer from further east than his actual assigned grid. At 11:26, Harper came back on the radio sounding furious, insisting that he'd been calling continuously but not a single person responded. They triangulate his actual position and found him near the old drainage, almost 300 yards off his sector, with no clear memory of how he drifted that far. He was confused, but he knew his name, date, assignment, team members. He just couldn't explain the last 10 minutes. He said that he followed Martinez's voice. Martinez had been with me the entire time. That was a point where command finally made the right call. Full withdrawal until daylight. Containment overnight at the outer access points. No more deep movement in Black Pine. People were too tired, too wet, and were too close to making mistakes, which should prove to be fatal. So we pulled out after midnight. Colin was missing. I didn't sleep. Hardly anybody did. By 5:30 the next morning, we had state SOL assets arriving, dog teams, daylight air support, pending weather, enough personnel to run an organised grid search. Daylight helped. It always does. The woods become trees again. The station clearing looked pathetic instead of malignant. The ravines had edges that you could see. The old tape lines looked like trash left by human hands rather than signs from something waiting just beyond the beam. For 3 hours, daylight almost convinced me that the night had exaggerated everything. Then the dog team refused the clearing, not balked generally, not poor conditions, The lead dog tracked Colin's scent from the trailhead up the ravine spur and spun off the old cart and directly into Black Pine Station. Now, once in the clearing, the dog circled, whined, and pulled towards a shed, then flattened itself so violently that the handler thought it was injured. They tried a second dog, same result. The animal would not cross the centre of the clearing and repeatedly redirected towards a shed door while growling low in its throat. The handler, a practical woman with no taste for ranger folklore, requested reassignment. She said the dog acting like this is not normal, and that it was acting like the source subject was present and absent at the same time. Those are her words, not mine. Now, late morning had brought the first real break. A volunteer named Sue found Colin's cap on a rock shelf north of the station, then a stretch of smeared blood leading through the scrub towards a narrow game trail, 50 yards further, tucked under a leaning pine as though he'd crawled into the roots, and we found Colin, alive. This is a part people expect to make the whole story less awful. It doesn't. He was hypothermic, dehydrated, half delirious, with a gash along his forearm, bruising on one side of his face, and both hands torn up as though he'd been climbing through rock or crawling through brambles for hours. His lips are blue. His eyes were open but unfocused. When I knelt beside him, he flinches so hard that he almost rolled away, then starts repeating one sentence over and over, chattering through his teeth. It knew my name. We stabilize him, wrapped him, and start the extraction. As his core warms slightly, he becomes more coherent in his bursts. Not enough for a full interview, but enough to help us get some pieces. He said that he left Ravenspur after finding an old path. He said that he saw the remains of the station around dusk. He thought somebody was there before he actually saw anyone. He described hearing a ranger call out from the trees, telling him not to be embarrassed, just to come down and that they'd walk back together. He then followed the voice because it sounded official, calm, and safe. Then, according to him, he saw a person in the old ranger station wearing a hat near the shed, waving him closer. When he got to maybe within 20 feet, something about the person was wrong. He couldn't say exactly what, only that the face didn't move right. He backed away. The person called him by name and he ran. After that, his memory came in pieces, falling in dark. Hearing his mother crying somewhere behind him, finding the ravine, seeing a flashlight through the trees and shouting for help. Then he realizes that the light was too high off the ground, moving in a straight line through brush that no person could walk through that smoothly. He then hid under the roots until he heard my whistle, or thought he did. He wrote the note while crouched in the shed because he was afraid he was losing his mind. Then, something moved outside and begins imitating every sound he made, breathing at first, then scratching, and then whispering. When he finally tried to leave the shed, he said there were people in the clearing wearing uniforms, and more than one, standing around his backpack. I asked later whether he was sure they were people, and he looked at me for a long time and then said, "They wanted me to walk with them." That statement never made it into the official report. He survived physically. After rewarming and treatment, the doctors called it a straightforward case of exposure compounded by panic, minor trauma, and sleep deprivation. He was lucky. Another 6 or 8 hours, it could have gone very badly. The county wrote up Warren Pike's remains as a separate recovery incident discovered during active search operations. Black Pine Station was temporarily closed to all staff except investigations and maintenance. Hazard signage went up. The old cut. End of story on paper. Except people keep talking. And yeah, I have actually changed the names of these from the real ones. Now, one of the deputies later admitted that he'd found boot prints around the old shed that morning, but the pattern made no sense. Different sizes, different tread ages, all overlapping, many of them stopping at the wall, as though whoever made them had stepped into the boards. The forensic team wrote it off as contamination from decades of use plus current search personnel. Reasonable, probably true. Still didn't explain the prints under the collapse side where nobody walked just yet. Teresa told me months later, after 2 drinks, and promised I'd never quote her publicly, that there had been 4 previous missing person incidents associated with Black Pine Ridge over 15 years, where survivors described hearing rescuers before any teams arrived. In 2 of those, the subjects were found moving away from the actual search lines because they'd followed voices deeper in. One man froze to death less than a mile from the trail. Another was recovered alive and insisted that the rest of his life there were extra rangers in the trees that night. The park never made a pattern because of it. There wasn't one you could put in a policy language that didn't sound ridiculous. There were other stories too. Most of them are local. Before the park boundaries were finalised, hunters supposedly avoided that ridge after dark because they believed that something followed and copied their calls. Elk bulgers, coyotes, human voices. One story actually claimed a fire watcher in the 70s abandoned Black Pine Station after 3 nights of hearing somebody climbing on the porch steps and stop outside the door without knocking. When he finally flung the door open with a rifle ready, there was nobody there, just the sounds of footsteps circling the cabin through fresh snow that showed no tracks in the morning. I cannot confirm that one. It came from a third-hand story of a retired maintenance supervisor who enjoyed old tales, but after what I heard, I did not dismiss it as quickly as I would have once had. Now, the old fire tower had been assigned to get dismantled for months, too unstable to maintain, too remote to justify repairs. I was going to do an inspection before the crew came in the next week to take it apart piece by piece. Should have kind of been a routine thing, but something felt weird. But it should have been just another forgotten structure in a section of a park that nobody visited. But the moment I reached the clearing, it feels weird again and too empty. Like the forest had pulled back from the area around the tower and never returned. I thought it was going to be the end of this thing, where it was getting dismantled, but it felt alive somehow. I turned slowly, scanning the trees with my flashlight, the beam shaking just enough to betray how tense I'd become. "Park Ranger," I called out, forcing authority into my voice. "If somebody's there, you need to respond." The words sounded flat as they leave my mouth, swallowed by stillness before they could carry very far. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then, from somewhere between the trees, something shifted again, just enough that I hadn't imagined it. I didn't like the distance. Too far to see clearly, too close to ignore. I stepped back towards the shed, keeping my eyes locked onto the dark gap between the trunks. The shed itself had barely moved more than the rotting structure, used decades ago to store maintenance equipment while the tower was active. Its door was swung open now, but just enough to show the strip of darkness inside. I knew immediately that wasn't how I'd left it. I was careful about those things. I checked it earlier and made sure that it was secure. Now it looked like something or someone pulled it open and stopped halfway through. I moved towards it again, because standing and exposing it clearly felt worse. The air in the shed felt wrong again, just like it always had. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinge gives a low drawn-out creak. It just seems like it was one last cry by the old tower before it gets dismantled. I looked through again, and things seemed different now, rusted tools that I hadn't recognized before. This time it looks like some things have been disturbed and moved there recently. I step in, turning to keep the doorway in view, and that's when I see another back wall. Long vertical scratches like I'd seen before, but somehow they look different, like the marks were more fresh. Now, it almost looks like they're made by fingers, and that's pretty scary. behind me though, something stepped into the dark, on the dirt. It wasn't loud, but the silence may have well been a shout. I turned sharply towards the doorway, my lights hitting the half-empty bed frame, just as though there's something passed by it. Blocking the faint light beyond for a fraction of a second, I see a shape, very tall, dark and wrong in a way that I can't explain. Hello? I call out and then stop myself. I just feel like somehow I know this is a bad idea. Now the silence wasn't followed by anything much. There was nothing occupying where I was, so I feel somewhat safer, but like something's still there. I keep my flashlight trained on the doorway, waiting for movement, just anything that made sense. But nothing came, no footsteps, no breath. Just the same suffocating stillness from all sides. Then slowly, something begins to form in the darkness beyond the door again. At first I thought that it was my eyes adjusting to the darkness, trying to make shapes out of the shadows, but this was different. The darkness itself was thickening, gathering into something deeper than the night would allow. It didn't step into the light, it resisted it. Like the beam of light can't actually penetrate or reach it properly. The edges bled into the air, shifting around, folding in on themselves in a way that made it impossible to focus. I felt my body lock up as it moves closer. There were no footsteps, no sound at all. The figure didn't walk, it advanced, smooth and unnatural, like it was being pulled forward rather than choosing to move. The closer it got, the more the air in the shed seemed to change, heavier and colder, breathing somehow. And yes, I feel pressing down on my chest, like I'm breathing but being forced to. I want to move. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of the shed, to run and step back into the trees, to put distance between me and whatever was standing there. Had I not learnt from before? Not learnt from the stories? But my legs wouldn't respond. Like, my body hadn't decided if moving was the right thing to do. The figure reaches a threshold, up close. It still had no clear form. It was vaguely human in shape, head, shoulders, arms, but none of it stayed long enough to be definite. Parts of it stretched and pulled unnaturally, like it couldn't decide how it was supposed to appear. The center of it was darker than anything I've ever seen, absorbing light rather than reflecting, a void where it should have been with detail. It leans forward, not stepped, not walked, just leaned, as if gravity didn't apply to it the same way. I could feel it now. The cold wasn't around me anymore, it was in my face. My breath came out shallow and uneven, as the space between us closes inch by inch. I tried to step back, but my heel hit something behind me. I'd realised I'd run out of room without looking. The figure keeps coming though, closer and closer, until it was right in front of me. I couldn't see a face. There wasn't one. Just that dense, shifting darkness where features should have been, but I knew somehow instinctively that it was looking directly at me, not at my face, but through me, like it was studying something deeper, something it didn't understand. The air between us felt wrong, thick and unmoving. My ears rang in the silence. I become hyper-aware of every sound that my body made, the faint hitch in my breath, the slight tremor in my hands, the dull pounding of my heart. Then it leans closer, so close that if it had been a person, our foreheads would have touched. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. For a split second, the darkness in front of me shifted in a way that almost resembles a face trying to form something. Like it was copying what it's seen but couldn't get it quite right. The shape distorted, stretches, and then collapsed back into a formless mass. And then it was gone. Not stepped away, not faded slowly, just gone. One moment it was inches from my face, the next the space in front of me was entirely empty. The cold snapped back, the air loosening like pressure had been lifted, and I staggered forward slightly as my body remembers how to move again. I sucked in breath as sharply, and it actually hurts. The doorway stood open, revealing nothing but the dark forest beyond. No shape, no movement, no sound, like it had never been there. But the feeling doesn't leave. The sense of being watched, of being measured, clung to me as I stumbled out of the shed, my flashlight shaking violently out as I scanned the clearing. The fire tower loomed above, silent and still, its upper platform barely visible in the sky. For a moment, everything looked normal again, and that made it worse, because I knew it wasn't gone. It had just stopped showing itself. I turned slowly, forcing myself to look up at the old tower, and that's when I see it. Not the figure, but something else. At the very top, where the old lookout cabin sat, one of the windows is open. I hadn't left it this way. As I started trying to convince myself it was just the angle, just the light, something shifted inside, not clearly, just enough to break the outline, like something was standing in there now, waiting. And then all of a sudden, the idea of going back up there, the reason I'd even come out here in the first place, felt impossible, like the worst decision that I could have possibly made, because whatever I'd just seen hadn't followed me down, it instead come above. Now from this point on, instinct took over, no training, no logic. Just a raw, immediate need to get away from that place. I've now turned without actually thinking and just start to run. The metal groaned under my weight, low sound that seemed to carry into the forest and disappear into nothing. I didn't look back inside, I couldn't, because even though that, I've just seen something vanish and then almost reappear, something deep in me was certain that it hadn't gone anywhere. I grabbed the ladder and start down. The descent felt wrong, the first step. My hand slipped slightly on the cold metal railing, my boots hitting each rug harder than it should have, and I rush. But I couldn't even slow myself down. Every second I stayed up there felt like a mistake. The higher up I'd been, the heavier everything felt. Like I'd stepped into a place that I didn't quite belong, or the rest of the world. Even as I moved downward, that feeling didn't fade completely. It follows me. Halfway down, something cracks above me. Not the normal weight shift of the tower, not the steady predictable sound of metal under stress. This was sharper and sudden, like weight shifting where there shouldn't have been any. I froze for half a second, but then suddenly my grip tightens on the ladder, my eyes locked forward as though refusing to look up. I don't want anything to make this feel more real than it already is, but then again, I hear a creaking sound, closer to the edge of the platform, right above me. That was enough. I start moving again, faster now, my hand slipping slightly as I skipped and keep jumping steps. The tower groans louder. With every movement, the sound echoing around me in a way that I've not heard it before. But then, something shifted. Not on the ladder, above it. I look up. I knew if I looked I'd see it, but then I didn't want to see it again. I dropped the last few feet to the ground instead of climbing properly, landing harder than I should have, stumbling forward as my boots hit the dirt. Pain shot up my legs, but I barely registered it. I push upright immediately, turning just enough to glance back at the tower, and now for a split second, I see it again. Not clearly, just a darker shape against the darkness, standing where I'd been. I can't process it now. That was the moment that it stopped being the investigation and it became more about getting out. I moved across the clearing, with my flashlight beam jerking wildly as I scanned the edges of the forest. The trees felt closer now, the boundary tighter, like the clearing itself had shrunk. The silence was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. It felt active, like something was moving just beyond what I could see, keeping pace without making a sound. The second I crossed into the trees, though, I felt it. The shift, like stepping from one space to another. The forest should have felt safer and more familiar, but it didn't. The darkness between the trunks seemed deeper now, thicker, swallowing the beam of my flashlight in places where it should have bounced back. I picked up speed without meaning to, my steps uneven, as I followed the trail by memory more than sight. And then, something moves to my left, fast. Not in front of me, not behind me, keeping up. I snapped the light towards it, but there was nothing there by the time the beam hit the trees, just empty space through the rough of the bark. I keep moving. My breathing had gotten louder, harsher, my chest tight with adrenaline as I'm being pushed forward. I didn't want to run. Running means losing control, risking a fall, but my pace was already too fast to be steady, and then I heard it again, closer this time. A shift of something tall brushing past branches without snapping them. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the edge of my vision, and I saw it. Not clearly enough, but it was there. A darker vertical shape sliding between the trees, watching my movements and matching it almost perfectly, staying outside of my beam of light. I turned my head forward again immediately, my grip tightening on the flashlight as I forced myself to keep going. I don't look down. Then the thought came out of nowhere, but it felt absolute. Don't stop. Don't turn around. Just keep moving. The trail drops slightly ahead, curving between thick trees, and the darkness seems to get deeper as I enter, and I feel the cold again, not as intense as the tower, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. Behind me, a footstep, not my own. I feel my stomach drop. I didn't hear it again, but I didn't need to. The silence that follows made it worse, heavier, like whatever made that sound hadn't realized it didn't need to anymore. It was closer now, way too close. I sped up again, my steps turning uneven as I push harder, branches brushing against my arms as I pass. The trail blurred slightly in front of me, my focus narrowed to the path and nothing else. And then suddenly, everything goes quiet again. Not the normal forest quiet, the same suffocating stillness as before. And I knew without looking, it was right behind me, close enough to reach, and I felt it, not physically, but like a presence passing into the space at my back, just inches away. My entire body tensed, my breath catching as I fought the instinct to turn around. Don't look. I kept walking, one step and then another, slow now, controlled, because running felt like the wrong move, like it would trigger something. The feeling stayed there, right behind me, matching my pace perfectly. Then it wasn't. The pressure shifted instantly, the air loosening just enough for me to take a full breath again. The forest sounds didn't return, but something about the space around felt empty. It didn't stop. It didn't turn around. It kept moving. The trail eventually widened, the ground leveling out as I got closer to the ranger road. The trees thinned slightly, the darkness easing just enough for my flashlight to be useful again, and then I saw it, the faint outline of my vehicle ahead. Relief hit hard, almost disorientatingly so, but I don't slow down. I kept moving straight towards it, my focus locked on the single point until I reach it and grab the door handle, with a hand still shaking. I jump inside. I lock my doors immediately and sat there for a second, breathing hard, staring out through the windshield into the darkness. Nothing followed me out. Nothing stood at the edge of the trees. The forest looks normal again, completely still, completely empty. I didn't wait. The engine starts and I drove. The road felt longer than usual, the headlights cutting through the darkness in a way that felt too narrow, like the trees were closing in just beyond their reach. I checked the mirrors without meaning to, half expecting to see something there, but something keeping pace with me in the dark, but nothing's there. Nothing. By the time I reached the station, the sounds had returned, the faint hum of equipment, the voices, the background noise that usually goes unnoticed. It felt wrong after silence. I park, sat there for a moment and finally get out. No one asked anything. Nobody notices anything off, and I didn't say anything. When I wrote the report, I kept it simple. Structural concerns. unusual environmental conditions, recommending immediate dismantling. Now, no mention of the figure, no mention of the cabin, no mention of anything else that could be explained in a way that doesn't sound right, because I already knew how it would sound and I shouldn't have really been doing any of this. A week later, the crew went out and took the tower down, section by section, exactly as planned. There was no incidents this time. There was no issues whatsoever. When they were done, the clearing was empty and the cabin was gone. The tower was gone. Just open ground where it used to stand. But this didn't feel right to me. I didn't go back immediately. I tell myself there's no reason to. The job's been done, the structure's removed, the area's cleared, and everything's signed off. Everything about it was routine on paper, but that didn't stop it from sitting in the back of my mind, constant and quiet, like something unfinished that I kept trying not to think about. A few days passed before I even considered it. Work continues as normal. Patrols, reports, the usual interactions with visitors. Nothing unusual came in from that section of the park. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing like what had happened before anyway. Now, it was as though that place never existed, and the tower was waiting to be removed. But the memory doesn't fade. If anything had become clearer to me, small details I hadn't focused on at the time start to stand out. The way the air had changed on the climb, the unnatural stillness of the clearing, the feeling of something moving beside me on the trail without making a sound, and the figure, not the shape itself, but the way it had been there, and not moving, not following the same rules everything else does. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, isolation, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in a place like that for too long, but every explanation I came up with felt incomplete, like it only covered part of what happened, leaving the rest untouched. Eventually, I decided to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see it. I went during the day. Full daylight, clear conditions. Nothing about the environment could be blamed for distortion or poor visibility. I took the same trail, same steady pace and movement, and tell myself that I'll put it to rest. The forest felt normal. That was the first thing I noticed. There were sounds, birds and insects, and the faint movement of wind in the leaves. Now, I felt the air being fresher and lighter, like I could breathe. There was no sense of pressure or unnatural stillness pressing in from all sides. If I'd known better, I would have thought I'd imagined everything. The trail opened into the clearing exactly how it should have, and the tower was gone. The space where it stood was flat, leveled out, the ground disturbed but already settling back into place. The crew had done a thorough job, and there were no large remnants left behind. No visible pieces of the structure, just a wide patch of earth surrounded by trees. I step into the clearing slowly, scanning the area out of habit, and nothing. No movement, no sound beyond the normal forest sounds. I walked to the centre, roughly where the base of the tower had been. The ground was so uneven, soft in places where the support beams had been moved, but it was otherwise unremarkable. I stand there for a moment, just kind of scanning the area, trying to feel something. But there was nothing. No cold, no pressure, no feeling of being watched. It felt so empty. Not in the same way it had before, just empty in the way that any clearing space in the forest would feel. I mean, why would it feel any different? But the history of the place, where was that? Was it in my head? Where was it? I let out a breath that I hadn't realised I was holding. For the first time since that night, I felt a sense of relief. Not complete, but enough to ease the tension sitting on my chest. Maybe that was it. Maybe whatever I had experienced had been tied to the structure itself. Something about the tower, the cabin, the enclosed space at the top. And it was gone. There was nothing left to hold on to, because whatever had been there before was gone. That was the explanation that I settled on. It made sense. It was simple. I turned to leave, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the far edge of the clearing, just before the tree line, There was a patch of ground that hadn't been fully disturbed, a narrow strip, maybe a few feet wide, where the dirt still held its original shape. I wouldn't have thought much of it if I hadn't stepped closer, but the surface wasn't smooth, it was marked. Long shallow impressions pressed in soil, spaced evenly, leading from the centre of where the tower would have stood through the trees. I crouched down slightly, my eyes tracing the pattern. There weren't footprints, not in any normal sense. There were no defined edges, no clear shape, just elongated depressions like something heavy had dragged itself across the ground without fully lifting itself up. The spacing was wrong too far apart in some places, yet too close in others. Like whatever had made them did so in a weird, inconsistent way. I followed them with my eyes, and they disappeared to the tree line. A faint unease settled back in my chest. I straightened slowly, glancing towards the forest. Everything appears normal, but the feeling from before, the one I tried to convince myself is gone, shifted slightly. Nothing wrong, nothing overwhelming, just enough to be noticed, like a memory pressing too close to the surface. I stayed there for a minute, trying to decide if I was overthinking. Was I? Then I stepped back. Whatever had been there was gone. The tower was gone. No reports, no incidents, nothing to suggest anything else remained. That was enough. I turned back to the trail, leaving the clearing behind without looking over my shoulder, but by the time I reached the main path, the feeling has eased. The forest sounds normal. I mean, everything felt normal. As I made my way back to the station, I told myself that was the end of it, that whatever had been tied to that place had been moved along with the structure. But I didn't see anything on the way out. But I knew that wasn't really going to be the end of it. Now, this should have been enough, really. This should have been where the story ended, but there wasn't a clean explanation to the sequence of events that made sense from start to finish. It was all fragments, feelings, brief glimpses, things that didn't leave behind solid evidence to point at and make sense of the situation. Now, this is how it stayed for a while. For the following weeks and months, everything seems normal. Everything is basically exactly how it was, and I catch myself walking past surfaces, catching myself second guessing. I definitely got a bit more paranoid after all of these things happened. I mean, everybody did there. I spoke to Martinez about some of these things, but he said, don't worry too much and just put your mind at ease. He said strange things can happen out there. There's a lot of things that go on that we don't actually report, which, if you try and get higher up the chain, they're just going to ignore you, or there's going to be a conspiracy of silence against you, and that wasn't something that I wanted happening. But for a while, nothing changed. There weren't too many new reports or strange reports from the area, no more missing people, no more bodies. For a little while, no hikers describing anything unusual. The trail remains quiet, rarely used, and the clearing stays exactly how it was when I was last there, just an open patch of ground surrounded by the trees. I passed near it once in a while on a routine patrol. That didn't require me to go all the way in. I could have. There was nothing stopping me, but for a little while I didn't. I just decided that it was best if I stayed on the main trail. But I remembered that some things started to change. I remembered one time that there was a storm and I was doing a normal search. Nothing too important, just checking out a weather station not too far by. Now, I've not been to this weather station for quite a while. I realised that as I'm walking towards where it is, I can see another ranger already up there ahead. That's good because it means we don't have too much work to do. He's just going to fill me in on what it said. I'll write down a few numbers and go. But who was it? I look up and I can see what's a raincoat. It kind of looks like the old classic ones, which fishermen would wear, the bright yellow, but this was dark, almost like a military green. I can see that this person has a long beard, and they slowly turn towards me, and then I get a chill. I get a feeling like this is bad. I can see them start to flash a smile towards me with old crooked teeth. Now, As this happens, I don't feel good and I start to edge backwards. I do this and the entire time the figure doesn't move. I keep reaching for my radio but I can't seem to find it. I go to grab it on my uniform but I don't know where I've left it. I then find it now. I put it in my pocket. Okay, I was starting to panic a little bit because usually I find it immediately. I go to radio in and ask what range is out here, and Martinez answers saying none. It's just you on your own here. I've been a park ranger for a little over 9 years, and in that time I've learned that people mostly get the wrong idea about what scares you out there. It isn't the predators. It isn't the weather, at least not in the way people think it is. It's not even the isolation, because most of the time, the isolation is the best part. What really gets under your skin are things that don't fit, things that seem to have their own rules, the trails that lead somewhere familiar but don't feel familiar anymore. The spots on the map that everybody knows about, but nobody likes talking about for a very long time. Every ranger who's been at it long enough has at least one place like that they've been to or knows of. One location they don't joke about, don't volunteer for after dark, and don't quite know how to explain it without sounding unstable. Now, I'm going to change the name of this for the sake of this story, but that place was Blair Lookout. Now, Blair Lookout was an old fire tower in the north sector of the park, about 6 miles off the nearest service road, and far enough from the public trails that almost nobody ever stumbled onto it by accident. It had been built in the late 40s, staffed seasonally for years, and then eventually decommissioned when the newer access road and modern observation system made it redundant. After that, it was left standing because nobody wanted to spend budget to remove it. By the time I started, it had become one of those forgotten structures that only existed in maintenance logs and old maps. Most of the newer seasonal staff didn't even know about it, until somebody mentions it during training. They thought it was a laugh, ask if it's haunted. And somebody older would shrug and say, not haunted, just not worth going to. That was a phrase people used, not worth going to. When the order finally came to dismantle it, nobody was sentimental. The tower had rusted at the joints and the stairs are deteriorating. One side of the cabin roof had started sagging badly enough that we couldn't justify leaving it there for another winter. The work crew was scheduled to head out the following week, but before they could do that, somebody had to make the final site inspection and confirm if the structure's stable enough to be taken apart in sections. That somebody ended up being me, mostly because I knew that region best, and I made the mistake of saying in a meeting that it would be a simple in and out job. The assessment should have taken half a day, drive out as far as the service road allowed, hike the remainder, document the condition of the base, supports and cabin and any hazards around the clearing, and then head back before dark. I'd done versions of that inspection dozens of times in old shelters, fences, and observation points scattered throughout the park. The difference with Blair was that the moment I heard its name, and there was an actual attached date, I felt something tighten in my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. I'd been to that tower often, but I'd been there enough times to understand why people talk around it. The first time I ever saw Blair Lookout was in my second year. It was winter, the trees bare, the ground hard enough to carry sound further than usual. I was shadowing an older ranger called Dean, one of those men who had been in the park so long that he seems carved into it. Like his skin had taken on the same weathering as the fence posts and old signs. Dean wasn't the type to spook easily, which is why what happened that day stayed with me. So we were checking the boundary markers after the storm, and Blair wasn't even on the route. But once we got within maybe a mile of the tower, Dean stopped talking. Not gradually, not because of the train getting difficult, he just stopped, like somebody had flipped a switch. When I asked him if we were close to something, he glanced into the trees and said, That tower was out of this way. Don't go up alone if ever that you're asked to. He said it so matter of fact that I laughed, thinking he was messing around with me, but he never smiled. He just keeps walking. Now, later on, when I asked him what was wrong with it, he didn't really answer clearly. He told me a story that didn't sound like a story at the time. Years earlier, when the tower was still occasionally used for seasonal patrols, one of the men assigned there logged repeated complaints about movement in the tree line at dusk. Nothing dramatic. He never claimed somebody attacked him. He never claimed to see an animal clearly. He just writing that each evening at nearly the same time, he would notice figures stopping at the edge of the clearing. Not one figure, several. Always at the tree line. Always too far to identify, and always gone if he looked directly for too long. The other assumed he was overtired or trying to get reassigned. Then the log entries changed. He stopped writing about the tree line and started writing about the stairs. He said something was climbing them at night, but would never be there when he opens the door. The sound of weight moving upward slowly as though somebody was taking their time. A week after that, he left mid-shift and walked all the way back to the road without his pack. Dean said the man never worked there at the tower again. I asked if any of that was official records. Dean just said, not the parts people laughed at. Then he said something that I didn't understand until much later. He said the tower was built on the wrong side of the clearing. I say, what do you mean? And he shook his head. He said like he'd already said too much. It means whoever picked that spot didn't spend the night there first. That stayed with me for the rest. The wrong side of the clearing, I wasn't sure why, because it sounded less like superstition and more like a practical mistake somebody had paid for. Over the years, I passed near Blair a handful of times, always in daylight, always with somebody else and never for long. The tower was impossible to miss once you knew where to look. It rose over the trees like a pin driven through the hilltop, dark against the sky, even in good weather. But for all the times I went near it, I only climbed it once before the final inspection, and that was brief. The climb happened in late autumn, maybe 2 years before they decided that they were going to remove the structure. A hiker ignored a closure sign and cut off trail, and we were checking the surrounding area for any sign of whether he'd wandered further north than reported. My partner at the time, Lewis, suggested that we use the tower to get a better line of sight. I remembered not wanting to, though I couldn't have told you why. We climbed anyway. The stairs seemed like they're not too bad, though every landing felt slightly tilted, as if the tower had settled unevenly over time. At the top, the cabin smelt wrong, not rotten, not animal, just closed in, like the air inside had sealed not too long ago, and had grown stale in a way that wasn't natural. Lewis took one look around and said, I hate this place. He wasn't joking. He said it quietly, almost to himself. I asked him what bothered him, and he pointed to the windows. The view should have felt like it was somehow expansive from up there, but it felt obstructed, even though nothing physically blocked it. He said the clearing looked smaller from above than it did at the ground, which made no sense. And then he added that he kept feeling like somebody was standing behind him whenever he faces the glass. We stayed there 3 minutes. On the way down, neither of us said much. Once we hit the tree line, Lewis stopped and stepped back and looked over the tower through the branches. Then he said something I still remember word for word. He said the cabin feels occupied even when it's empty. After that, he refuses every request to check Blair again, and nobody gives him trouble for it. That was the sort of place it was. Even the people who didn't believe anything about it seemed happy to avoid there. So when I was assigned the final inspection, I told myself that all of that was exactly why it needed doing properly. Structures like that gathered stories. Stories get embellished. The simplest way to kill a bad story was to walk through the place in daylight, document what was actually there and remove it. Once the tower was gone, The atmosphere people had warped around it would go away with it. That's what I told myself on the drive out, and I checked it again later while checking my gear on the trailhead. And again, when I started the hike. Now, rational explanations work best when you keep repeating them. Now, the weather was clear but cool. One of those late season afternoons when the light already seems tired by noon. I parked at the end of the service road and hiked in a basic inspection kit with a camera, radio, notebook, tape, and enough water to stay out longer if needed. The trail wasn't officially one anymore, just an old maintenance path half swallowed by brush. It rose gradually enough through the spruce and pine and then levelled out off a ridge before bending north towards the clearing. I knew the terrain well enough that I didn't need to check the map more than once, but I kept reaching for it, as if confirming location more than usual mattered. The first hour was normal, birds moving through the higher branches, insects where the sun hit the brush, and the occasional creak of trunks rubbing somewhere out of sight. The kind of forest sound that keeps you company without ever becoming distant enough to focus on. I saw deer tracks near a muddy runoff and evidence of porcupine chewing on one of the old marker posts. Everything looks ordinary, but about a mile from Blair, the trail surface changes, and at first I thought it was just the soil composition shifting, because the ground grew softer and more compact, but then I realised the texture isn't natural. It looked pressed, not flattened by vehicle use, but worn in by repeated foot traffic. Pressed down broadly, as though something heavy was there that hadn't left a clear tread. I crouched and checked a section where the light hit properly. There's no tyre marks, no boot lugs, no animal print, just shallow compression running along the path in a way that I couldn't make sense of. It faded after about 20 yards, and then appeared again further on. I took a few photos more out of habit than concern and kept moving. Strange ground signs aren't unheard of in the backcountry maintenance area. Still, it was the first time that I got the feeling that I was walking into somewhere that had been recently disturbed without any obvious reasons. The thing I noticed was the sound, or lack thereof. It happened slowly enough that I almost missed it. One minute I could hear the usual forest background, and the next I realised I'd been listening to my own footsteps for too long, so I stopped and waited. A breeze appeared and moved under branches, but somehow the motion made almost no noise. There was basically no insect buzz, no bird call, nothing. There are natural quiet spells in the woods, especially when a predator passes through and the weather shifts, but this felt total in a way that made me aware of my own breathing. I checked the time, earlier than I expected. The light hadn't dropped much, but suddenly it felt later. I remembered thinking that if I'd been there as a new seasonal ranger, I probably would have turned around and invented some practical reason to reschedule. But the experience can make you stubborn in unhelpful ways. I kept going because turning back would have felt like a mistake somehow. Turning back just wouldn't have been the right thing to do. But anyway, I told myself the silence was temporary, that I was reading too deep into the old stories and was too attached to the place. I tell myself that right until the cabin comes into view in the tower. You never approach Blair head on. The path bent around a low rise opening onto the hilltop, which meant the first thing you saw was the upper third of the tower lifting over the trees. That day, the metal frame caught the weak afternoon light and held it in a way that made it look almost wet. The cabin at the top appears darker than I remembered, the windows flat and opaque from a distance. Once the trail fully opened into the clearing, I stopped without meaning to. The clearing itself wasn't large, maybe 40 yards across at the widest, ridged tightly by trees, except for a narrow break where the old maintenance path entered. The tower stood slightly off-centre, with a shed near the north side and a collapsed stretch of old cabin fenced behind the woods and the weeds. What made it unsettling, and always had, was the placement. Dean had been right about that. The structure should have been set on the opposite end to maximise visibility and keep the stairs facing the approach. Instead it sat on the north side, closer to the tree line where the slope dropped sharply. From certain angles it seemed like something built in the clearing, and more like something that had stepped in from the woods and stayed there. I walked the perimeter first, taking photos and notes, corrosion along the western supports, evidence of roof wrapping above the cabin, ladder from the roof hatch no longer secure, ground substance near one foundation block. All of it matched the general reason for removal. The shed beside the tower had one door hanging crooked on its hinges and contained nothing useful except a rusted fuel drum and a few lengths of shelf shavings and split shavings. I checked inside, noted signs of moisture damage, and stepped back out. The whole time I worked, I had the persistent sensation that the clearing was too small for the tower, not physically but visually, as if the proportions don't line up. The base looked close and the top looks further away than it should have, enough to make the stairs seem steeper than they actually are. By then, it was getting later than I liked. Not close to dark, but far enough along that I knew I needed to do the interior check and start back. I radioed the station before climbing, partly for procedure and partly because I wanted to hear another voice. Reception was poor but unstable, but I could use it. I gave my location. I said in the beginning that I'm in the final interior inspection. I get half of an acknowledgement back. The static followed longer than the response. I clipped the radio to my shoulder and looked up the stairs. Blair's stairs wrapped around the old frame in 4 tight runs with landings at each corner. They aren't true ladders, but they were steep enough to force you into a rhythm. The metal groaned under me from the first step, which isn't surprising. What was surprising though was how irregular the sounds were. Instead of expected series of answering creaks under each footfall, the tower seemed to answer late, like a second or so behind me, as though weight was settling elsewhere in the structure already further than I'd moved on. At the first landing, I paused to photograph the western support bolts. As I wrote down a note about the rust bloom and joint separation, I became aware of something below me, not a movement, a visual pull. I looked down into the clearing and got the oddest impression in the ground at the base of the tower that shifted slightly clockwise. Now the shed, the entrance to the path and the line of fencing all looked correct when viewed individually, but they seemed almost misaligned by a degree or two, as if the clearing had turned while the tower stayed still. I blinked hard, looked away and back again. Everything was normal. I'm confused, yes, but I blame the angle. The higher I climbed, the more uneasy I got, though not because I saw anything. The detail people always expect. They want the branch snap in the trees or the figure at the end of the clearing. That wasn't what made Blair bad. What made it bad was the sensation that the space around you was arranging itself differently when you weren't paying full attention. At the second landing, the tree line looked closer to the north side than it had from below. At the third, I had the brief absurd thought that the shed had no door, though I'd just been inside it. By the fourth run, I'd stopped looking outwards unless I had to. The cabin door stood partly open when I reached the top. I knew I'd never seen it closed properly, but I also knew that 2 years earlier, Lewis and I had left it wider than that. I remember because the latch was stiff and we joked that no one would bother breaking into a condemned fire tower. This time, the gap was narrow, maybe 4 inches, just enough to show darkness inside. I stood on the platform listening before I touched it. The tower made its normal high altitude tick and groaned under shifting temperature. Beyond that there was nothing. No wind in the trees, no insects. Just the small metallic complaints of structure under my own breath. I pushed the door open and stepped in. The first thing that stuck with me was the smell. Dust and old metal, damp wood from a roof leak, and beneath that, something mineral and stale that reminded me of a cellar sealed for too long. The second thing was the floor. A thick layer of dust covered most of the cabin boards, but not all. There was an open near the centre window where dust had been distributed repeatedly, not swept, not walked through in obvious boot prints, pressed and smudged like a pattern I couldn't immediately read. I now crouched so I can try and photograph it, and saw that the dust was stacked in long curved lines, some overlapping, some broken, as if with broad contacts at some points over and over. I stood back, and probably more quickly than I meant to. The room was small enough that one step in any direction brought you close to either the windows or the old desk that had been bolted near the east wall. I took general photos, checked the roof seam from the inside, and documented the sagging board above the hatch ladder, and then forced myself towards the north-facing window to access the visibility from the top. Now, that view should have overlooked the drop beyond the clearing and a broad expanse of treetops beyond the ridge. Instead, what I saw made me lose track of my note-taking completely. The ridge was there, the trees were there, but the depth beyond them looked wrong. The landscape flattened after a certain distance, like a painted backdrop. Hills I knew should have been visible in that direction are absent. For a few seconds I thought the weather must have moved in without my noticing. Some layer of haze or low cloud, but above the sky, everything remained completely clear. It was only from the view of the windows that seemed compressed, like the world ended too close to the tower. I just don't know how to describe it other than that. Now, I moved to the west window, same effect, then the south. From there, I could see the path entrance and the shed below, and for one sick moment, I thought I saw somebody standing beside the shed wall. My pulse jumped hard enough to blur my vision. I stepped closer to the glass and nobody's there, just a dark ventricle seam with the door swinging open, but the image held so immediate, so specific, that I found myself scanning the whole clearing for movement, but nothing moved. I kept thinking and worrying. Now, that's one of the things that people don't understand in this job. Even when something feels wrong, procedure has a way of pulling you forward, even in panic. You keep measured, checking, recording. You do practical tasks because practical tasks are proof that you still belong to the normal world. I note the condition of the support and photograph the corner rot and cross to the small shelf under the east window where the old tower logbooks were sometimes left. I didn't expect to find anything. Most of the records had broken from years earlier, but there, under a layer of grit and mouse droppings, was a thin black ledger swollen slightly from moisture. I opened it carefully. Most of the pages were blank or too water damaged to read. Then about halfway through, I found a section with entries still legible enough to decipher. Dates from the early 70s, fire weather, visibility, routine supply notes, nothing unusual at first, and then the handwriting changes. Same writer, but tighter, less consistent. One line caught my eye immediately because it was so short compared to the others. It read that stairs heavy after dusk. Something heard on them. Went out twice. Nothing there. If they ask me, I'm not staying next week alone. That's all. There was nothing dramatic, no endings, no final revelation, just scattered lines between ordinary reports, like something had made them worse. Now, I was still reading when I heard the first sound below. It was faint enough that I thought it was part of the tower settling, a hollow metallic tap, then another. I closed the ledger and held still. The taps came again spaced irregularly. Not inside the cabin, not on the roof, lower. I moved to the door and listened from the threshold. There it was again, a small impact against metallic sounds, somewhere further down the staircase, then silence. Hello. I called before I could stop myself. The word dropped out of the cabin and seemed to vanish halfway to the ground. No answer came back. Of course not. Still, calling out made the place feel instantly more hostile, as if I'd admitted I expected an answer. I leaned over the railing and looked down the stairs again. The angle only allowed me to see portions of each section, and a slice of the clearing below, empty, no animal and no real obvious cause of the tapping. So I decided to step back inside and wait. Nearly a minute passed before the sound came again, this time from higher up, not above me, closer than before. Somewhere around the second landing, 3 taps in quick succession. It was like something light striking the outer rail and then nothing. A rational person would have decided that, I don't know, maybe something loose was on the metal and shifting in the breeze, but there was no breeze. I know that sounds like a small detail to be fixated on, yet it mattered. The trees beyond the window barely moved. The air in the cabin had the stagnant stillness of a room underground. Whatever made those taps, it wasn't wind. I told myself that I'd do one final sweep of the room, take the ledger and leave. That was the moment the cabin floor changed under my feet. Not dramatically, not enough to throw me. It just gave the sensation of settling in a direction that made no structural sense, as if the boards had tilted towards the north wall by a few degrees. The desk looked slightly lower on one side. The disturbed dust near the centre seemed to run in a different curve than before. I closed my eyes hard and opened them again, and the room appeared normal, but I was done. Inspection or not, I was done. I tucked my ledger into my pack and moved toward the door. The tapping starts again the instant that I touched the frame. Not below this time. Beneath me, yes, but close beneath me, directly under the top platform. A rapid series of knocks moving upwards along the metal support as though something was striking each joint in sequence occurs. I backed away from the threshold without meaning to. The sound continued for maybe 4 seconds and then stopped so abruptly that the silence afterwards felt violent. I have asked more than once why I didn't run away. The answer is that fear doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it makes you listen even harder. Sometimes it makes you convince yourself to stay still. You understand what's happening, and understanding will save you. So I stood there in the cabin, heart hammering, trying to locate the source of the knocking in my head. Support beam, outer stairs, a branch. Something dislodged under the platform. But every explanation fell apart because of the ribbon. It travelled upwards. Then the tower gave a single deep groan from somewhere below, and I felt movement under the stairs. Not a visible movement, a transfer of weight. The entire structure answered it faintly, the way a tall mast answers when somebody begins climbing from the bottom. That's when I finally moved. I stepped onto the platform and grabbed the railing, looking down the staircase, ready at last to see a person or animal on the lower ruins. But nothing. The stairs are empty all the way to the clearing, but that sensation that something had started up them remained so strong that I nearly called out again. Instead, I settled down. I told myself to go steadily, not recklessly. Old stairs push panic. I managed the first 2 runs at a controlled pace, though I kept glancing at the open risers at the ground below. The clearing looks further away than it should have from that height. The shed seems to have shifted closer to the tower. On the 3rd run, I become aware of a second pattern of sound beneath my own footstep, not simultaneous, offset. Every time my boot hit the step, I heard a second answer from somewhere below or behind, soft but distinct, as if another weights were landing a fraction of a second after on the same metal. I stopped. The answering sound stopped. I started again faster. The second pattern resumes. By the next landing, I was no longer pretending with myself. Something was on the stairs with me, or something about the tower wanted me to stay there. I leaned over the railing, trying to look up and down the central shaft of the structure all at once. Nothing but intersecting beams and thin slices of the clearing. Yet the moment I straightened, I felt that awful proximity at my back when somebody steps too close and behind you in a narrow hallway. I went down 2 steps at a time after that. The tower complains loudly now, rattling at the joints, but the answering steps kept pace, sometimes below me, sometimes strangely level with me despite being in an open space. Once, on the corner landing, I caught movement through the outer frame on the north side. Not a shape I could define, just impressions of darkness and something passing upwards along and outside supports where nobody could possibly have climbed. It was there and gone too quickly to trust, but It drove whatever caution I had straight out of me. I nearly fell on the final run. My boot slipped on a patch of rust and I came down hard on one knee, one hand slamming against the railing. The pain shot up my leg so sharply that for a second I almost blacked out. I got up immediately anyway and jumped the last several steps of the clearing. I landed badly and staggered. I then turned. The staircase above me was empty. No movement, no person, no animal. No branches scraping the frame. Just a dark zigzag of stairs climbing into the shadow and the cabin above with its door still open. I stood there breathing hard, waiting for some final practical explanation to show itself, but none did. The clearing was silent again, and I mean like completely silent this time in a way that I've not heard it before. Now that should have made it easier for me to leave. Instead, the place felt like poison, like I'd interrupted something rather than escaped. I grabbed my camera from where it had swung around and I took one quick photo up the tower, more out of reflex than intention. Then I headed for the shed because I had left a measuring tape inside it, and because of the part of my training still working, don't leave scattered gear around even in a moment like that. The shed door was wider open than before. I remembered that clearly because the angle I approached. I could see further inside than when I'd first checked. I could also see that the back wall had been marked. Long pale streaks ran vertically through the dark weathered boards, 5 or 6 grouped together, fresh enough that the exposed wood stood out. I stopped 6 feet from the doorway and didn't move any closer. I hadn't seen those marks earlier. I knew I hadn't. I would have photographed them. I would have noted them. Now, they looked as if something wet or abrasive had dragged down the wall repeatedly. I left the tape where it was. Some people imagine courage as doing the braver thing in a clearing, drastic moment, real courage. Now, if that exists, it was probably much smaller than that. Now, it's knowing when common sense has finally won and obeying it without shame. I walked straight past the shed and towards the maintenance path. Not ran, walked. Because some primitive part of me was convinced that if I ran, something else would start running too. So I made 3 steps before I felt the clearing at the back change. Again, not a sound, a change. The way you know a room has darkened before you consciously notice the lights have gone out. The air on the back of my neck turned cooler. The silence intensified rather than breaking. I kept walking, slow, even steps. Don't look back, don't speed up, just leave. That's all I was focused on. My breath sounded too loud. My pack is slapping loud against my jacket. Under that, after a few yards, I heard something enter the trail behind me. It didn't sound like footsteps. That would have been almost easier. Footsteps would have implied a body moving the way bodies are supposed to. What I heard was a sequence of faint compressions in the ground and brush, broad and soft, yet spaced too far apart and too irregular to fit a person. Sometimes close together, sometimes with a gap of several seconds between them, but each time they came, they seem a little neater. I keep walking. You can tell yourself a lot of things when fear arrives first. You can say it's an animal shadowing you. You can say that the pack is shifting against your ears and changing the way that you hear your own movement. You can say the old stories are getting into your head. All those explanations remained available to me, maybe for the first minute. Then the trail bent around a rock crop out, where the trees pressed close, and from my left at shoulder height, something moved through the brush with absolutely no accompanying sound. I saw only motion, patches displaced in a smooth line parallel to my path, the way something tall might move just inside of the trees if it were careful not to touch more than it needed. I snapped my head towards it, but there's nothing there. The branches settled too slowly. That was when I broke into a faster walk. The ground signs I'd noticed on the way in become more visible now that my mind had a use for them. The broad compression sections of the trail appear every 20 or 30 yards, running ahead of me and then fading, as if something heavy had used the path before me and then used it again. Twice I caught myself choosing where to place my own feet to avoid stepping directly into those pressed areas, which is ridiculous in hindsight, but at the time it felt instinctive. I did not want my boots in whatever had made them. The forest stayed unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no alarms, no sudden explosions of small animals bolting through the underbrush. Whatever was happening, the woods were not reacting to them in a normal way. The only sounds were mine and the intermediate broad disturbances behind or besides me, never steady enough to track, never absence enough to dismiss. At one point, I made the mistake of glancing over my shoulder. I didn't see a face or figure in any clear sense. What I saw was a section of trail maybe 30 yards back where the space between the trunks looked darker than the surrounding shade. Not a cast shadow, nothing. More like a vertical absence of detail, moving forward in a broken increment. There 1 second, hidden the next, but always slightly nearer after each blink. I turned forward so quickly that I nearly twisted my ankle. My heart was beating hard enough that I can actually hear it in my throat. Now after that, I stopped checking behind me. I focused entirely on the path and not losing it. That was harder than it sounds because the trail itself had started feeling unreliable. Distant stretches, turns seemed longer to take than they should have, and landmarks that I remembered passing in on the way disappear. That's a kind of panic that comes from realizing a route that you know well is no longer behaving how it should. It doesn't matter how reasonable you are. Some of the older part of the brain takes over and starts whispering that if the path changes, maybe the place changes with it. If the place changes with it, then you may actually never be able to leave. Now, I hit the first stream much harder than I probably should have, to be honest. I was very worried, and I couldn't hide this fear. Now, the path should have reached maybe 20 minutes from down the tower at the pace I was keeping. It took at least 36. I know because I checked my watch 3 times during that. The watch is working, the sky darkened in a normal way, yet the hike was back eating time too quick. At the stream, I crouched to splash water on my face and maybe regain a sense of control. The moment I stopped moving though, I sensed a presence behind me too stopping. The silence became so absolute that I could hear the water treading over the stones and nothing else. I didn't want to turn around, but I did. The trail was empty behind me, but there, on the far bank where the mud should have had every recent crossing, was a broad, disrupted patch with no usable prints in it, not one mark, just a surface pressed smooth and dark, as if something had rested its weight there without the edges, without tread, without definition. It began maybe 2 feet from where the path seemed to enter the stream and ended at water, but nothing came out the other side. I got up so fast I nearly left my radio in the dirt. From then on, I abandoned any effort to appear calm for my own sake. I moved as quickly as I could without outright running, pushing through the brush where the path narrowed, nearly slipping twice on loose roots. The station still seems miles away, but at least the ridge section ahead would be slightly open and give me better straight lines. That thought kept me going until the ridge came into view and I realized something else was wrong. The light beyond it looks wrong. No marker, misplaced. There was a wash of late afternoon gold coming through the trees from an angle that it shouldn't have, as if the sun had shifted north. For a second, I actually stopped and looked up through the branches to orientate myself. The sky itself appears normal. Then I looked back down the path and the light was ordinary again. I don't know if it was panic, fatigue, or something else about the way the ridges channeled sunlight in the day. What I do know is that it felt like the forest had noticed me trying to measure it and corrected itself too late. About a mile from the road, I finally got my radio to pull a clear signal. I thumbed the transmission button with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking and called the station again. I intend to say something measured about structural instability and request another station meet me at the trailhead. Instead, what came out was, "I need someone at the road now." I probably shouted out of breath. I definitely sounded wrong. The dispatcher says, "Am I injured?" and I say no. He says, "Am I in danger?" I remembered looking into the trees as he said this and not knowing how to answer. By the time I keyed the button again, all I could bring myself to say was, just have someone here. The last stretch of road was honestly the worst by far. Not because of anything dramatic, but because I could feel the thing behind me losing patience with distance. The disturbances in the brush stopped being intermittent. They began occurring so often, sometimes on both sides of the path, as if they'd followed me, no longer content to stay behind. Once I heard a tree trunk give a low strained creak at my right, the sound of pressure being applied to wood, enough force to break it. Another time, a cluster of fern folds flattened at once beside the trail and sprang back after I passed. I never saw a body, I never saw a face, but by then I didn't need to either. Something was escorting me. It was close enough that I could feel the attention of it on my back and my neck. When I finally saw the breaks in the trees where the service road cut through, the relief hit so hard that it almost makes me give up and my legs go weak and collapse. I stepped from the forest into the open ground and turned before I could stop myself. The path beside me lay empty between the trunks, quiet, harmless, just dirt road, nothing. I was standing there until the headlights rolled around the corner and washed over me. It's Greg from the evening shift. He pulled up in the utility truck and took one look at me and says, "Have I fallen?" I realised then that my right knee was pretty messed up and I had dirt and rust on me from the staircase slip, and that there was blood drying through my pants. I said I'd come down hard off the tower steps and wanted a ride back rather than risking hiking in the dirt in the dark if my knee tightened up. The story I gave is this. He looked past me towards the trees as if expecting something else, then nodded and let me in. I didn't mention the rest on the drive back. I just couldn't. Greg talked a little about routine things at the station and then stopped and realised that I wasn't answering. At one point, he asked whether the structure was stable enough to remove. I said yes, but I heard myself add, "Do it in daylight." He laughed once lightly as if to break the tension and then glanced over to see if I was joking or not. At the station, I cleaned up in the washroom, bandaged the knee, and sat at my desk to write a report. That part might have been the hardest in its own way. The fluorescent lights humming, somebody in the break room laughing at some point on the phone, a microwave door slamming. All the ordinary sounds of the staff building were happening around me, and yet the tower felt so close, like I'd brought some of its geometry back in my head and I couldn't settle it down. I stared at the blank report template for a while before typing. In the end, I wrote exactly what could be defended. Severe corrosion at primary joints, cabin roof compromised, stair safety questionable, removal requested without delay, with full crew only. I include the photos I've taken and roof damage. I didn't include the disrupted pulse patterns in the cabin because I didn't really have a good explanation for them. I did not include the ledger notes because once I set them on my desk and looked at them under good light, I found myself unable to decide whether introducing that history would help in any reasonable way. Most of all, I did not include any mention of the descent, the following presence on the trail, or compression in the mud stream that made no sense at all because nobody would take that seriously, and part of me couldn't stand the thought of hearing it repeated later with amusement. I kept the ledger in my locker overnight, now intending to review it in the morning and maybe scan the surviving pages of the archive. When I opened the locker the next day, the ledger's there, but the legible entries I made were gone. The pages were still water damaged, crisp, stained with age, but the lines about movement at the north edge of the stairs were no longer there. Not torn out, just erased. Just blurred beyond recovery, as if the ink had decided 50 years later to just let go at once. I stood there holding it under the harsh locker room light, feeling really confused, wondering if anybody had done this. The dismantling crew came about 4 days later. I made sure that the assignment put me elsewhere in the park that morning, though that didn't stop me from checking the radio traffic more often than I should. The job took most of the day. They reported nothing unusual, a few bolts more stubborn than expected. One support had to be cut rather than unfastened. The cabin roof nearly gave way during the removal, which only reinforced the written recommendation. There were no injuries, no bizarre sightings, no complaints about the clearing, the stairs, or the woods around it. But late afternoon, Blair Lookout was a stack of rusting sections strapped to flatbeds and an open patch of churned earth at the north side of the clearing. Now, to be honest, I expected relief, and got something more complicated. Part of me was relieved, yes, but another felt like I'd participated in something of which I did not understand. Dean said the tower was on the wrong side of the clearing. Once it was gone, I kept wondering what had been wrong with that side before anybody built it. I considered pulling out older land surveys, looking at records, and predate the tower construction. I mean, maybe I was going to find evidence of something being different there. I don't know. An older cabin, a burn scar, or some practical feature that might explain why the spot always made people feel uneasy, but no, I never did. Curiosity sounds noble until it points the wrong direction. A week after the dismantling, I returned to the site in full daylight for a final closure check. I didn't want to go, but the route was already on my schedule, and refusing it would have raised questions that I was not willing to answer. So I had to go. The hike felt ordinary. Insects, wind, birds. The compact patches on the trail were gone. The stream crossing showed normal prints from deer and one of the set of boots. By the time I reached the clearing, I could almost convince myself the whole incident had been the accumulation of fatigue, expectation, too many old stories. The tower was gone, the shed had been collapsed, and the clearing was pretty much as it should have been. Only some rectangle shapes of exposed ground remained. And it's already collecting needles and stuff. It was kind of going slowly. Without the tower, the clearing looked bigger and somehow less coherent, as if removing the structure had revealed the shape that had been intended to remain open. I walked the perimeter, checking for discarded hardware, photographs of a completed removal, and stood there for a moment. Now, nothing happened. It matters because horror stories like this have a final sting, the last proof and threat that makes sense of everything. Now, life works in a quieter way. Most of the time there's no final sting. This is the only memory of a place and of the knowledge that you can't make or feel unless you've actually been standing there. So I remained there for 10 minutes. The forest sounded like a forest. The air moved normally and there was no pressure. No following movement in the trees. No sense occupied from above. If anything lingered there, it gave nothing. I walked back without incident. After that, nothing else happened at Blair. No missing hikers, no strange calls, no animals found in odd condition, no late reports from staff about movement in the north trees. Now, this area gradually faded into the back of what had always been on paper a retired maintenance site with no public significance. If anybody ever asked about it, I said the tower had finally come down because it was unstable. I thought that would be the end of it and it would stay with me, but it wasn't. The thing that remained wasn't the image of the clearing or even the sensation of something behind me on the trail. It was smaller and somehow harder to shake. It was the way the tower had felt occupied before I had any reason to think it was. The cabin, the stairs, the compression. From the moment I stepped into that room, that I had arrived in a place where something else had already established a pattern. Those disturbed arcs in the dust, the old log entries, the late answering creaks in the structure, they all point to the same idea. That's the one that I don't like, and I say to myself aloud. I don't think whatever was wrong with the Blair belonged in the forest in the general sense. I think it belonged to that specific arrangement of height, enclose, and placement. I think the tower, by accident or bad judgment, had been erected over something in the clearing that should have really been left alone, or at least not given a staircase. No, this is not a scientific explanation. It's not even a complete thought, but it is closer to the truth of what felt like it than any version involving stress or imagination. Once in a while, especially in late season when the light drops early and the radio traffic thins out towards the evening, I think about the man who wrote these lines in the old ledger. Movement at the North Ridge again. Closer tonight. Stairs heard after dusk. Went out twice, nothing there. If those words were real when I read them, and I know they were, then for 50 years at least, there were scattered people who stood in that cabin and tried to fit the same wrongness and put it into practical senses. That may be the part that unsettles me the most. Not that one bad afternoon in the old tower, but there were many others there who had their own versions in, and found no better language than I did just to describe it all. Now, I still work the park, I still take remote routes alone. Old places still need check-in, and I still do the job, but there were things that I no longer volunteer for, and there are silences in the woods where I listen more carefully than I would have. If a young ranger ever asks me whether there's any part of the park which is truly odd in a way that we can't explain, I don't tell them ghost stories, I don't tell them about shapes in the trees or somebody climbing up the stairs that nobody can see. I just tell them what Dean told me in the beginning because it's simple, in its own way, honest. Some places are just not worth going to. And if they ask which place I mean, I say there used to be a fire tower in the north section called Blair Lookout, which is gone now. I tell them the crew took it apart in daylight, hauled every section out, levelled the ground, and nothing stood there after. I tell them no one reported anything strange afterwards. I tell them that the clearing's just a clearing now. All of it's true. What I don't tell them is that every now and then when I'm out near the ridge at the right hour, I find myself looking north through the trees for a shape that isn't there anymore and listening for metallic sounds where there is no metal left. I never heard anything, I never seen anything. The path stays still for now, the woods remain ordinary and the moment passes, but for those seconds, I remember exactly how it felt to descend the stairs with somebody keeping pace where nothing should have been, and I understand why some of the other older staff pretend that they don't know about it. Because once you reduce a place like that to a story, people either enjoy it too much or dismiss it too easily. And whatever was up there, though, never deserved that recognition either. Now, I'd been a ranger for 11 years before they transferred me to Black Pine District, and in all that time, I learned to separate the real dangers from the stories people tell to make ordinary things sound worse. The real danger was weather turning faster than the forecast. Real danger was a bad step on shower with no partner close enough to hear you fall. Real danger was underestimating distance, cold, injury, or exhaustion. Those stories were different. The stories were for tourists, seasonal workers, and the kind of people who wanted to stretch every part of the trail and make it seem darker than it was or give it a legendary story. So when I arrived at Black Pine, the first thing I found out after a ranger told me was, don't spend the night near Marker 14 if you can help it. I assumed he was handling me in a way like I was a new guy, giving me the local superstition, the way that every district should. He didn't say it like a joke though. The way he said it stayed with me. He said it while going through the handover notes at the station, almost as an afterthought, while explaining washouts, dead radio zones, and which access roads turned to mud after heavy rain. Marker 14 was deep on the eastern side of the district, along an old service trail that hadn't been used regularly in years. There was an abandoned backcountry ranger cabin out there too, one of the oldest structures left over from before the trail network had begun to change. Now it was still standing there, and it was efficiently used as an emergency shelter in bad weather. The outgoing ranger just tapped the map with one finger and said, if you ever have to check that area, do it early. If you get delayed, just turn back. Just try not to stay out there. I asked him why. He hesitated longer than expected, Then he gave me the kind of answer that sounds practical until you think too much about it. He said the area had strange orientation issues after dark. When I said, "What do you mean?" he said people got turned around more easily than they should, even on clear nights, even with lamps, even on trails they knew. He said that there had been a few reports over the years of lost hikers insisting they'd found the old cabin, gone inside, then somehow backed out facing the wrong direction entirely, like the door no longer opened towards the trail. He said it in such a flat, careful tone that I almost laughed, because it sounded absurd, but he wasn't smiling. I now asked him if there's been any injuries out there. He said no confirmed ones. That phrasing bothered me more than the rest. In the first few weeks, I didn't go anywhere near Marker 14. I had enough to learn the district, checked routine sites, and getting used to the terrain. Black Pine was different from the western sectors I'd worked before. Denser, steeper in places, the kind of forest that seems to absorb light earlier than it should, especially under the pines. The understory was thick with deadfall and fern in some areas and nearly empty in others, leaving long lines of sites that somehow felt more unsettling than dense brush. There were stretches of trail where you could see deep into the trees and still feel like something important was being hidden from you. The first time Marker 14 came up again was because of a missing dog. A couple from out of state had been taken to a restricted connector trail that they shouldn't have been on, camped even further without permission, and woke up to find their dog gone. Most missing dog calls in parks resolve quickly. Animals circle back, gets picked up by another hiker, or shows up muddy and exhausted near a road within a day. But the couple were insistent that the dog had ran towards an old Eastern Service trail sometime before dawn, and one of the volunteers who took the initial report mentioned seeing fresh movement near the old cabin route, so I was assigned to do the check. I left just after first light. The trail was longer than it looked on the map, beginning wide enough for old maintenance vehicles before narrowing into a track half reclaimed by the roots and half lift litter. There was little trail markers up to a point, and just old service posts at weird intervals, each one leaning a little more than the last. The air that morning was cool and still. For the first hour, it felt like any other search route. No bird calls overhead, damp ground underfoot. Enough wind in branches to create that low consistent movement you stop noticing after a while. And then, the trail begins to dip towards the eastern ravine, and the atmosphere changed in a way that's difficult to explain without making it sound exaggerated. The forest didn't go silent all at once. The sounds just stopped leaning properly. The birds were still there, somewhere, but further apart. The wind was moving, but only in certain sections overhead, not all of them. My footsteps began to seem louder than they should have been, and even more spaced apart and for longer. I found the dog's collar halfway to Marker 14. It was caught on a broken sapling just off the trail, still damp. One of those cheap nylon collars with a metal buckle and tag. The tag had no name engraved on it, just a vacation sticker and a phone number half worn from rubbing. There was no blood on the collar, no fur caught in it. It just looked less like something had been ripped off, and more like it had been carefully slid free and hung there. I remembered staring at it longer than necessary, trying to decide why that bothers me so much. A few yards beyond that, I found prints in a patch of soft ground. At first I thought they were dog tracks heading downslope, but once I crouched, I saw that they don't make sense. They were dog prints, yes, but overlapped with something else. I mean, like, there was no boot prints, no paw prints, more like long narrow impressions in the soil that curved slightly inwards at one end, as if somebody had pressed a hand sideways in the mud without fingers, leaving individual marks. There were several of them, spaced at regular intervals and then irregular ones. They don't follow a normal walking pattern. They look like something lowered itself to the ground repeatedly while moving. I took some photos and radioed in the collar find. The reception was poor but workable. I said I was continuing towards Marker 14 and went to check the cabin if the track pattern held. Dispatch acknowledged and told me to update in an hour. It was a routine exchange, but once I clipped the radio back to my shoulder, The ordinary sound of another voice felt strangely temporary, like something borrowed from a different place. Marker 14 itself was an old post at the edge of a clearing, half hidden by brush and leaning so badly it looked like it was ready to topple. Beyond it, maybe 100 yards further in, stood the cabin. The first thing I noticed is that it was bigger than I expected. Not large, but bigger than the word cabin had led me to imagine. It was dark, with a structure built like weathered timber with a low pouch and a pitched roof sagging badly on one side. The windows were boarded from the inside except for one small one. With that small one, there was just enough to let light in. Now the front door was shut. Around the structure, the trees pulled back, just enough to form a narrow pocket of space, though the clearing wasn't clean. It was cluttered with fallen limbs, old equipment half swallowed by moss, and a rusted hand pump near which must have been a water barrel. It should have looked abandoned in an ordinary way, but it didn't. The whole place gave the impression of being watched over rather than neglected, not maintained, just monitored, as if the forest had allowed the structure to remain for a reason. I circled the outside first. No signs of forced entry, no dog visible under the porch along the debris. There were marks on the wood at shoulder height along one side, but not claw marks exactly, more like abrasions, long rub patches where the weather had been worn smoother in several vertical strips. At the back of the cabin, I found the first undeniable sign that something had been there recently. The ground below split and showed disturbance in the needles and dirt, as though something had stood there for some time shifting its weight. Still no blood, still no fur, no clear sign of the dog. I knocked once on the cabin door before opening it, out of habit more than expectation. The inside smells of damp wood, old dust, and something fairly sooty underneath that I couldn't place. Not rot, not animal waste, just an organic smell that didn't belong in an empty structure. My flashlight beam moved over the interior in slow passes. One table, 2 bunks split into the wall, an iron stove, shelving near the rear with a cracked basin, and some rusting containers. Everything was coated in dirt and age except for one area in the middle of the floor. There, the dust was disturbed and disrupted. Not completely gone, just broken by overlapping tracks and smears too confused to interpret immediately. Now I stepped in, scanning carefully, and found dog prints crossing the room. They led towards a rear view wall. Now, there was no rear door. That stops me cold. The prints reached the wall beneath the window and ended. No turnaround, no return trail, just a small paw print in the dust and then nothing. I checked the window. It's too small for even a medium-sized dog to fit through, and broken, still with jagged wood piercing inward. There was no blood on it either, no fur caught in the splintering edges. I ran my light along the seams in the wall, around the bunks, under the stove. Even though none of it made any sense, the dog prints had not come back out, they simply stopped. I should have left. Instead, because I had a concrete search objective, and still believed that everything had explanation if you search enough, I stayed to inspect further. I found a hatch in the floor near the bunk, swollen from damp but not sealed. I took effort to lift it. Beneath it was a dirt crawl space deep enough for pipes or old storage, maybe 3 feet high at most. My flashlight cut down through the opening and revealed earth, stones, and some collapsed wooden framing, and nothing else at first glance. Then I saw 2 faint points of reflection in the back in the dark. My brain identified them as animal eyes, as I had time to reason through the distance or size. I called softly, partly hoping it was a dog. The reflection didn't move. They remained fixed for several seconds, and then vanished all at once as I shifted the angle of light. I started staring into the crawl face for even longer than I wanted to admit. Nothing came back. No movement, no sounds, not even the scrape of something repeatedly dragging itself into the earth deeper. Nothing. Now I closed the hatch. That was a moment that I decided the search had crossed into something I didn't want to do alone. I radioed dispatch again, reporting the find and the odd interior tracks and a possible den or crawl space under the cabin floor that needed a second ranger before I continue. The radio crackled heavily before the reply comes through. The dispatcher told me that the nearest ranger was over an hour away. I could either hold point to return or come back later with support. I choose to leave. What happened next is a reason that I've not gone back to that cabin. I stepped out onto the porch and immediately know something changed. The clearing was the same. The trees were the same. Marker 14 still leaned where I had left it, but the angle of the lights was wrong. I checked my watch because the shift was so sudden that I must have stayed in there longer than I had thought. I hadn't. Barely 20 minutes passed, yet the light in the clearing had flattened into the late afternoon tone that gets you closer to evening. The shadows were pointing in directions that didn't match where the sun should have been. I remembered standing there trying to orientate myself and failing. The trail entrance looks narrower. The slope beyond marker 14 looks steeper. Even the hand pump near the cabin seemed closer to the porch than I'd remembered, even though I'd passed it only months earlier. I started backing away. By the time I reached marker 14, I knew the trail wasn't the same. It wasn't still there. That's the part, the awful part. It hadn't vanished or transformed into something obviously impossible. It was just subtle, unmistakably wrong. The ground dipped where it should have risen. Trees I remembered passing on the way are in the opposite side of the path. A rotting log I knew had stepped over in a split decision was wrong. Every few yards something would catch my attention and tell me that I was not retracing my route well. Yet the trail itself remained continuously beneath my feet. I stopped and turned around. The cabin's no longer visible. It should have been. Even through the brush, the clearing was small enough that I should have at least seen the roof line. There was nothing behind me but a corridor of trees. A cold pressure settled in my stomach low. I pulled out my map, checked my compass, and forced myself to breathe slowly. The compass needle wavered longer than usual before settling. I adjusted my direction against the map, chose to return the heading, and kept going, 20 yards now. There had not been a fork in the way. Both branches there appear equal and equally neglected. Both bore the same pattern of worn ground and half-submerged roots. I crouched to inspect them and saw, in the thin layer of damp soil, those same long narrow impressions I'd found earlier mixed with dog tracks. They went down both branches. That did more to unnerve me than anything else so far. Not because it was impossible in a dramatic sense, but because it suggested a system, a pattern already in place. The forest was not merely confusing, it was presenting alternatives with equal evidence, as if waiting to see what choice it would make. Now, I took the left branch because the slope felt familiar. It led me 10 minutes downhill to a second clearing. This one had no cabin, just a rectangle of flattened ground where a structure must have once stood, ringed by old stones and collapsed timber, almost fully absorbed by moss. At the centre of the clearing was a rusted iron bed frame and half buried in needles. I stood there listening for my own breath. I had never heard of a second cabin in that district. There's no record of one on the map, and yet the clearing had the unmistakable feel of a place where people had once lived long enough to leave a shape behind. I'd backed out without actually going any closer. When I returned to the fork, I took the right branch. That one climbed instead of descending and eventually rejoins the main service trail, exactly where it should have been, less than a quarter of a mile from the cabin. The moment I hit that familiar stretch of track, the atmosphere changes again. The sound of the forest returned in a rush so subtle that I didn't notice it at first. A jay somewhere overheard, wind pushing through higher branches, the ordinary movement of dry needles under small feet. It should have been company. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made me feel as though I'd walked out of a sealed room into weather. I did not go back that day. I returned to the station, filed the report, and recommend that if anybody checks a cabin again, it should be done with 2 rangers, full daylight, and a GPS log in the route from the trailhead onward. I left out the second clearing because I already knew how that would sound. I also left out the part about the trail changing orientation because I could not prove it, and because even writing it privately made me feel ridiculous. The missing dog was never found. The owners eventually left, upset but resigned. After we expanded the search without result, there was no carcass, no signs of predation, no further collar or tag, it was just gone. A month passed before marker 14 comes up again. This time it was a hiker. Not missing exactly, at least not in the official sense. A man in his 40s took a wrong connector during a solo hike and called for help when he realizes that he had less water than planned and his phone was dying. Now, we ping his location roughly east of the main district, close enough to the old service trail that my stomach tightened the second I hear this. By the time I got there, there was another ranger. He had made his own way back to a maintained trail and was waiting on a bench at an access point, power and shaking harder than the weather justifies. He wasn't injured, he wasn't incoherent, he was just badly frightened in a Pacific way people often are when they know something was wrong, but also know they'll sound like they're unstable trying to explain it. He told us that he'd found an old cabin and gone inside to rest for a while in shade. He said it smelt terrible and felt colder than outside, but he was low on the water and figured that he'd sit there for a few minutes before reorientating. Then he heard scratching under the floor. He thought it was an animal. He said it moved from one side of the room to the other without pause, too fast for something in that cramped space, then stopped directly beneath where he was sitting. He stood up to leave and discovered the front door opened into dense trees instead of a clearing where he entered from. He was very calm when he said that, almost overly calm, like somebody delivering details that they know should sound insane. Now, he said that he went back inside, crossed the rear window, and saw the clearing there instead. By the time he turned back, the door was facing the clearing again. He left immediately after that and got lost for another hour before reaching the trailhead which he recognized. My partner thanked him and told him dehydration and stress can cause perception disorientation and recommended that he rested before driving home. He nodded like he expected that answer, but right before he left, he looked directly at me and said, "There's another place out there too. I saw it through the trees, something older. Don't tell him that it wasn't real." I didn't answer him because I knew exactly what he meant. After that, I started asking questions of the older staff, not the kind that go into reports, just offhand conversations over coffee. Mentions of the Eastern Service Trail. Whenever anybody remembered old structures out near marker 14 besides the cabin still standing there, most would shrug it off, saying that they'd heard it through rumours, and rumours of old trapper shelters further east, long before the park existed officially. One retired volunteer, a woman named Elaine, who had been cataloguing archive photos for years, told me that there had once been a line camp in that region before the cabin was built, but she couldn't remember where exactly. She said that there had been complaints from the first crews who cut the service route that their compass hadn't drifted near the ravine, though she added that half the men working in that area were drunk whenever records were taken. Then she said something I still think about. She said the cabin at marker 14 had not been the first one, but the second. The first, according to her, burned. I said, "Did anybody die in the fire?" She looked at me and said, "Well, not officially." That same week, rain moved in and washed out several western trails, which kept me away from the east side entirely. I told myself that was a relief. I told myself that the district was big enough to contain unsettling places without requiring me to develop some obsession with one of them. But the truth was that I thought about the cabin constantly after, not because I wanted to go back, but because I kept trying to understand what kind of physical layout could produce the same descriptions from multiple people without any shared story containing them. Doors open to the wrong side, interior larger or smaller than it should be, another clearing visible where it shouldn't be, trail splitting, then not staying apart. Now it got worse when winter closed in early. The Eastern District saw less foot traffic as temperature dropped, and with that came more silence from the area. Silence was well and truly relief in park work, to be completely honest with you. Now it means no calls are imminent, and there's no reason for you to head out there to marker 14, but it also meant that if something happened out there, it would happen again. Now this is exactly what occurred in late November. A seasonal wildlife technician named Aaron failed to check in on time after surveying motion cameras along the eastern ridge. He was competent, careful, and familiar with the district. Losing contact with him for an hour did not necessarily mean trouble. Losing contact near sunset and bad weather did. A search team was assembled fast because I knew the eastern trail best by then. I was on it. The three of us initially were there, moving in with headlights and radios while snow started coming down the thin sheets and through the pines. The plan's simple: sweep the main ridgeline, then check the service trail entrances and old cabin routes if we don't get a response or radio call. I was hoping fiercely that Aaron had twisted an ankle and was going to be found by some ordinary drainage ditch and waiting to be annoyed by our concern. We found his pack first. It was upright against a tree just off the service trail, zipped with his spare glove tucked neatly under one strap, as if that he'd actually set it down intending to retrieve it in a minute. That was wrong enough to stop all three of us. No one packs like that in this weather unless they have a reason. Then 10 yards in, we found one of his surveying poles stuck in the ground upright, then another, then a third. They formed a rough line towards marker 14. The snow had already begun obscuring older tracks, but in the light of our lamps, I could see a confused pattern of footprints overlaid with long through-like disturbances dragging through powder. Aaron's boots headed in. They did not head back out. We've actually called for him until our voices grew ragged. No answer. By the time we reached the clearing, full dark had fallen. The cabin was there. It was porch dim under the sweep of our beams, snow collecting along the roof line and porch trail. The clearing itself looked wrong in the light, larger than during daytime but somehow shallower. It was as if the trees stood painted at the edge rather than rooted. My two partners moved ahead while I radioed our position and get static. Then a broken reply. Hold. Proceed with caution. Requesting additional support. The usual words, but stretched and degraded by poor reception until they sound distant and unhelpful. The front door of the cabin was open. That stopped my partners. I don't know what they were thinking, but I knew what I felt. Not surprised. Recognition. The same sick, immediate understanding that the place had changed before we arrived, and that we had arrived late. Aaron was inside. At least part of him was. He was standing near the rear wall facing away from us, one hand resting on the edge of the lower bunk as if steadying himself. Snow dusted his shoulders and the hood of his jacket. For one impossible second, I felt relief so hard that I almost buckled to my knees. Then one of the others calls his name, and Aaron turned around very quickly. And there are some images that never blur with time. His face was white and cold, lips are cracked, eyes wide enough that the whites fully showed around the irises. But what made the moment wrong was not his expression, it was that he seemed not to recognize the doorway at first. He looked straight past us, not at us, scanning the opening as if expecting it to lead somewhere else. Then he blinks hard, like really hard, and lurches forward. We got him outside and wrapped him up immediately. He could walk, barely, but he kept trying to turn back towards the cabin, even while saying we had to leave. Not go back in, leave. Those are his words. We had to leave before it. lined things up again. That phrase meant nothing to others. It meant nothing in practical terms either, but the fear in his voice was enough. We began moving him out of the clearing without attempting any deeper search. At that point, there was no deeper search to conduct. The person we had come for was there. Now, halfway back to the main trail, Aaron started talking more clearly. He said that he followed what he thought was an old service spur looking for one of his cameras after the GPS glitched. He found the cabin and went in, and got out of the wind while checking the map. The first strange thing that he noticed was the interior seams rotated relative to where the windows should face. The second was the snow outside changing direction depending on which way he looked through. Now, he said he left once that he ended up in a different clearing with a burned foundation and pieces of iron in the ground. Then, somehow, without remembering the path between, he then went back inside the standing cabin with the hatch and the floor already open. He never went near the hatch. That part he repeated several times. He said that he heard movement below, not scratching, not crawling, just the sound of somebody repositioning themselves very carefully in a very cramped space. He backed towards the door and found the door looking onto a wall of roots and dirt, like the cabin had been built inside of an embankment. When he turned again, the room was normal. He stopped talking after that and wouldn't answer our questions for a while until we get back to the vehicles. Aaron took leave after that incident and never returned back to field work. Officially, what happened was strictly between us, I guess, but we knew there was more to this. Now, in our report, it listed mild hypothermia, disorientation caused by weather, and also some probable navigational errors, but no mention of changing the doorway, no mention of the burn clearing, no mention of the hatch. At that point, I should have let it go. Instead, I made the mistake of looking into the archives himself. Elaine helped me find old black and white survey photos before the current ranger cabin was built. Most are poor quality, but in two of them, I found what looked like the same clearing with a different structure at its centre. The first cabin, smaller, rougher, more like a lion's shack rather than a ranger shelter. In one photo, there were men standing on the porch, in another taken after the fire. There was almost nothing left but a blackened rectangle and an iron bed frame which I'd actually seen in the second clearing before. The photo sleeve included a typed note from decades earlier, not a full report, just a summary line from an incident record. The temporary shelter lost to the fire during winter occupancy, one man missing, presumed dead, site abandoned, replacement cabin constructed adjacent following spring. Adjacent, not the same site, adjacent. That word mattered. If the first cabin had burned in one clearing and the second cabin was built in another besides it, then the second clearing I found was real, or had been real once, which meant that people who entered the standing cabin and somehow reached the burned site were not imagining something from anywhere. They were crossing into whatever relationship existed between the two places. I wish I could say that information to a supervisor and insist the areas closed permanently. I considered it. I even drafted part of an internal recommendation citing unstable terrain, unreliable ground, and just, bad navigation, and the risk posed by abandoned structures. But every practical justification I wrote felt too small for what I was actually trying to warn about, and every true detail sounded impossible. In the end, I did what many people do in jobs like mine, and I waited and monitored. I hoped that nobody else would go out there alone before winter locked out the route entirely. Then December brought the storm. It came in harder than forecasted, dumping enough snow over 2 days to close secondary roads and force us into emergency response mode across half the district, power lines down near the south entrance, a stranded family in the back road, 2 search calls which thankfully ended up with us finding people near maintained trails. By the third night, everybody's exhausted. That was when dispatch got a call from a teenager who had borrowed his uncle's snowmobile without permissions and gone onto the closed parkland with 2 friends. The machine broke down somewhere east of the ridge. One friend manages to hike far enough to regain phone signal. So the other 2, they're still out there, and that's a big problem, especially in weather like this. It's too rough. Now, they give coordinates, but they're not very specific. And they're very close to marker 14 though. That's a problem. I volunteered because before anybody could assign me, which sounds noble until I tell you the truth, I volunteered because the idea of sending somebody unfamiliar with that area in a storm felt worse than going myself. 2 of us went in on track utility machines as far as conditions allowed, then continued the final mile on foot because the route narrowed too badly in the drifts. The snow changed the forest in a way that almost made the district feel ordinary again. Everything was softened, simplified, reduced to trunks, white ground, and black gaps between branches. Then we passed marker 12, and the sense of wrongness is so strong that I almost have to stop myself walking forward and further. Not silence this time, distance. The headlamp beams look shorter. The trees seem to absorb more light than snow-covered pines should. My partner Nate notices too. He kept checking his lamp as if the batteries were failing. We found the first teenager near a drifted log, cold and panicked but mobile. He said that the other boy had gone ahead looking for shelter and had seen a cabin through the snow, pointing east. Nate and I looked at each other and said nothing. We moved faster after that, following the broken trail and drag marks from somebody stumbling deep enough in snow, just not able to push far. Snow is still coming down but thinner now, enough that we can see maybe 30 yards clearly with lamps. Now between us to the next line of trees, I caught a shape more than once that looked like a roofline through the white. We entered the clearing. The cabin stood there with lights inside. Not electric light, a low-range flicker like fire. I stopped dead. There was no power to that structure. There was no fuel there. Literally nothing. No legal reason for anybody to be inside with flames. Nate started towards it, and I grabbed his sleeve hard enough to jerk him back. I don't know what explanation I was trying to form. I just knew with absolute certainty that we could not rush that doorway like it was a normal shelter. The front door was open, the warm light moved over the snow on the porch boards. From within came a crackle of a stove fire and the faint metallic knock of cookware settling. It looked safe. That was the worst part. It looked exactly like rescue, exactly like the end of danger. Then I saw the window. Through the side window, beyond the firelit interior, there was no rear wall, only darkness and falling snow continuing much faster than the cabin could physically allow. I shone my lamp harder across the glass. The room did not reflect it properly. The light seemed to enter and disappear without brightening anything. Nate saw it too. He said quietly, "That's not right." The teenager we found started calling his friend's name. From inside the cabin, someone answered. Not with a repeated voice, just an imitation. Just a normal human shout, strained and frightened. It sounded like the missing boy. "Help me." One time, then nothing. Nate moved before I could stop him. He hit the porch in 2 strides and aimed his lamp through the doorway. I was right behind him. And that's when I saw what feels like it was impossible even in memory. The cabin interior was not the cabin interior. Not exactly. It contains the same table, same bunks, same stove, but arranged inside a deeper room that could not have existed inside the outer walls. The fire burned in the stove, yes, but beyond the warm circle of light in the room extending further back into the shadow than it should have by several impossible yards, at the far end, near where the rear wall should have been, stood the second teenager. He was pounding on something invisible between us and them. I know how crazy that sounds, but it looks just like that. His hands struck at air at chest height, and they kind of reverb like he's hitting plastic. His mouth was open in a yell, but we can't hear him over the storm and stove crackle. The impression over his face is terror. Nate stepped across the threshold. I caught his pack and hauled him back so hard that we both nearly went down. The boy at the far end then turned around, not towards us but downwards at the floor, at the latch. The hatch near the rear bunk was open. Something below it moved, not up into view, just enough that it changes the darkness inside the opening. The teenager begins hammering harder, and suddenly the entire room shifted depth. It contracted by a fraction. The length again, like something breathing through architecture. Nate swore and raised his radio, but static tore through so violently that he drops it from his ear. I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I step on the porch, reach sideways and slam the door shut. The fire instantly vanishes. The room beyond the window went dark. No shouting came from inside out after, just wind. Just for several seconds, and none of us move. Then the teenager beside us started sobbing that his friend was still in there. I don't know whether what I did next was courage or stupidity, maybe both. I opened the door again, and went inside the cabin like normal. It's cold, dark, empty, no fire, everything normal, no teenager, just abandoned bunks. It's really strange now. Nate went in then, because it looked like an ordinary search and rescue for any reasonable angle. That was it now. I go in with every nerve in my body trying to force me back. We check the corner, the bunks, the table, everywhere, but there's no body, no sign, nothing. Not a single thing. Now, in the dust near the wall, there were footprints from a single pair of winter boots which lead to the hatch. They did not lead back. We find the missing boy alive the next morning, half a mile west of the cabin in a drainage ditch, delirious with cold but survivable. He remembered leaving the broken snowmobile to look for shelter. He remembered finding a cabin with a fire already lit. He remembered a man inside sitting by the stove with his back turned. He never saw the man's face. He said that the man kept one hand on the floor near the open hatch and moved the other hand from side to side as if feeling for vibrations on the boards. The boy said that he knew instantly that they should not go further into the room, but the heat from the stove felt so good that they had to step in anyway. Then suddenly he was outside, but he has absolutely no memory of how he got there, and he also has no explanation of the time in between. After the incident, the district closed the Eastern Service route completely, not because of anything supernatural in writing, of course. Officially due to hazardous structures, poor winter access, and repeated navigational problems, the cabin was marked for removal in spring. Spring came, the crew went out, and they came back without touching it. The reason was simple. The structure wasn't where it was supposed to be. They found marker 14, they found the clearing, they found the old hand pump, but the cabin itself was gone. There's no sign of collapse, no fresh debris, nothing. Now, they logged it as probable map error and things like that, but I know the truth of this place, and I think everybody does. Now, the first thing you notice in deep winter is not the cold, even though the cold is what everybody warned you about. It's not the darkness either, no, because darkness in the forest is something you learn to work with after years. The first thing you notice is quiet. There's no changes in the woods in a way that feels almost unfamiliar, because it makes everything beautiful, and then makes every sound that you rely on a lot harder to hear. It softens footsteps, buries trail edges, hides roots and rocks, and turns distance into guesswork. A ridge that should be 20 yards away looks like it's right in front of you, and a tree looks close enough to touch can actually be several minutes off, or even further. That night, quiet was worse than usual. It did not feel like the snow-absorbing sound. It felt like the forest had stopped making sounds on purpose. I was working in the winter search and rescue in the Northern District at a section of the park that closed to regular visitors once a heavy snow come in. On maps, it looks simple enough. On the main ridge trail, 2 markers connected, several emergency catch points, and the old service road that was no longer maintained past the first gate. In reality, it was a hard place to move through. The ridge followed into narrow gullies, and gullies fed into the frozen creek beds, and once the snow settles, everything starts to look like it's the same. Even people who knew the area could get turned around if they left the main trail at the wrong point. That's why we took winter calls seriously, even though they sounded small. Now, the call came in just after dusk. The 2 hikers had not returned to their rental cabin outside the park boundary, and the friend who reported them said that they had planned a short snow hike up towards a ridge. Now, this was not supposed to be in the deep backcountry. They're not supposed to be there. They are not supposed to be out after dark. They had enough gear for the afternoon, not a night. The kind of situation that happens more often than people think. Someone sees a trail online, underestimates the weather, starts late, and assumes that they can turn back when they want. In summer, that can mean discomfort. In winter, it can mean hypothermia before midnight. I was closest, so dispatch sent me ahead while the others loaded equipment and started towards the trailhead behind me. I remembered sitting in the truck for a few seconds after parking, watching snow drift through the headlights. It was not a blizzard yet, but it was steady, thick enough to soften the world beyond the windshield. Now I have a radio signal, but it's weak. My headlamp was good. My pack was stopped with everything routine. I had no reason to feel the knot in my stomach, which I did, and it's already started forming before I even stepped out. The trailhead sign was almost buried, with only the top half visible above the snowbank. I checked the time, logged my location, and started uphill. The first stretch was familiar enough, a slow incline through spruce and fir, with the main trail still visible as a shallow depression under the fresh snow. My boots crouched through the top layer and sank into the older crust beneath. Every breath came at me with a white cloud. The world felt small inside the headlamp beam, just trunks, snow, and thin path ahead. For the first 20 minutes, I found nothing unusual. I dropped the gear, no broken branches, no signs that anybody had packed up and gone off the trail. Then I found the tracks, 2 sets of snowshoe prints, fresh enough that the edges had dropped despite the shape in the snowfall. They were moving uphill, close enough at the start and then staggering as the slope steepened. I crouched and checked them with my light. Adult-sized, 2 people, consistent pace and no signs of injury. That's a relief. Tracks were a gift in the winter. They turn uncertainty into direction. I radioed the dispatch and tell them that I had 2 steps heading towards Hawker Ridge. They came through broken but clear enough. Continue tracking. Back up 20 minutes from the trailhead. Now I acknowledged and move on. For a while, the search becomes simple. Follow the prints, keep pace, watch the snow. Listen for voices or movements. The ridge trail curved through thicker trees, and the wind started picking up behind me and above me, shaking loose clumps of snow from the branches. Each time that ones fell off, it hit the ground with a soft but heavy thump that sounded too much like somebody stepping just outside of the light. About 40 minutes in, the tracks changed. They did not split exactly. That would have made sense. One person turning off the trail and the other continuing. Instead, both steps continue forwards but besides them, almost perfectly in parallel. A third line appeared. At first I thought it was drag from a branch or a part of snowshoe scraping the surface, but when I bent down, I can see individual impressions, long, narrow and deep. Not human boots, not snowshoes and not animal tracks. They ran beside the hiker's prints for maybe 15 yards and then vanished. I stood there for longer than I really should have, staring at those marks. They were too evenly spaced apart to be fallen from snow, now too narrow to be a deer, too long for a coyote or wolf. They almost looked like somebody had pressed at the edge of a board into the snow over and over again, but there was no drag between them. Each of the marks was clean and with a purpose, so I photographed them, measuring one with my glove and kept moving. A few minutes later they appeared once more. This time they were closer to the hiker's tracks, not overlapping, not interfering, just closer. I tell myself that there were plenty of explanations that I hadn't thought of yet. Old ski tracks disorientated by snowfall. Branch shadows confusing my eyes. Some maintenance equipment I've forgotten about. That is what you do when you find out that something doesn't fit. You don't jump to fear. You search for the ordinary explanation at first, because ordinary explanation saves lives and panic does not. The trail steepened as it approaches the ridge. Visibility dropped. The trees grew shorter and more twisted, their branches overloaded with snow, forming dark tunnels over sections of path. The hiker's tracks were still clear, but their pacing has changed. The spacing becomes uneven. One of them had started and then suddenly stops again before turning, leaving deeper impressions where they shifted their weight. The other one stayed steadier but closer. The second one, though, is though the hiker had a slower pace but was trying to keep up. I then found the first piece of gear, a glove, black and insulated, lying palm up in the snow beside the trail. It had not been dropped casually. It had been placed there. I know that sounds like a small dissection, but you learn the difference. Dropped items tumble, land wrong, half covered on branches. This glove was flat on the surface, fingers straight as though somebody put it down carefully and kept walking. I picked it up and felt inside, still slightly warm, or maybe I imagined that because I wanted it to mean that we were close. Now I radio again. The signal cracks badly this time, static breaking up words, but I got enough through to report the found gear and continue tracking this. Dispatch asked if that I had voice contact and subjects. I said no. The radio then hissed, and beneath the hiss came a faint crackle of sound, slow and regular, like something tapping a fingernail against metal. I turned the volume down slightly and the tickling stopped. I tell myself it's just interference. The trail crested sooner than I expected. That bothered me because I knew the route. I should have had another quarter of a mile of the ridge, but it flattened. But suddenly the ground leveled out. The trees opened into a long white corridor between the two slopes. The hiker's tracks continued straight through it. The third set of narrow impressions appeared right beside them. Only now they were between the two hikers and not beside them. I stopped. The snow fell suddenly through my light. The corridor ahead was empty. No voices, no movement, just 3 lines of tracks leading away from me. 2, but just not very clear what exactly they were. I keep wondering, waiting for backup. It would have been the correct decision if I believed that there was an animal threat or an injured person nearby, but the temperature was dropping, as if the hikers were still moving. Now losing time could be worse than continuing. I marked the location, gave another radio update that probably did not transmit cleanly, and followed. The corridor led to a section we called the White Bowl, a shallow depression below the ridge where snow collected in deep drifts. In daylight, it was easy to cross if you knew the route. At night, the snowfall, it was a trap. The edges blurred into slopes, and it became difficult to tell where solid ground began and the holes were buried. The hikers had gone into it. Their tracks sank deeper, and the third mark stayed behind them. Halfway across the bowl, one set of human tracks stopped. Not faded, it stopped. There were 2 sets which were very deep, where the person had stopped still, and then nothing ahead, nothing turning back, no fall mark, no sign they had removed shoes, or no disturbances around the area. The second hiker's tracks continued for another few yards and then circled back. I could hear that part clearly, panic, confusion. The remaining hiker had turned, stepped around the place where the first track ended, and then moved again now, faster. The third line of narrow impressions continued through the spot where the hiker had vanished. I stood in that bowl with snow falling around me. For the first time that night, I felt genuine fear. Not concern, no urgency, but fear. Now, Because the tracks do not end like that, bodies do not stop existing in the middle of open snow. If somebody fell into the hole, there would be a collapse. If somebody stepped onto buried ice, there would be cracking or a drag. If somebody was lifted, carried, dragged, attacked, there would be evidence, but where was it? I can't find any. I call out then, I shout both the hiker's name, even though that the dispatch had only given them to me once, and I had to check my notebook to remember. My voice sounded flat in the snow. It didn't echo, it did not carry. It simply disappeared a few yards ahead of me, and no answer came. I radioed again, and this time I get only static. I tried changing position, lifting the antenna, turning back towards the ridge, but there's nothing. The radio hisses in my hands, and then ticking comes back. Slow and patient. Tap, tap, tap. It did not sound electronic. It sounded like something inside the radio, though I knew that made no sense. I shut it off for a few seconds, turned it back on, and the static returned without tapping. I followed the remaining tracks. They left the bowl at an angle, cutting down towards a strand of black spruce so dense that it looks like a wall. The hiker had been moving so fast by then, slipping and staggering, sometimes flaunting both poles hard enough to punch through the crust. I found the second piece of gear near the trees, a water bottle still half full, frozen at the top. And then a torn strap from a pack, then one snowshoe, unclipped and lying face down. Each of the items seems like it was neatly placed there. This is a part that I can't make sense of. A panicked person drops things badly and they scatter, they leave a mess. These items formed a line, almost like an offering: glove, bottle, strap, snowshoe. All on the left side of the tracks, all facing upwards. The spruce swallowed the trail of prints. I had to push through the branches of heavy snow. It's snapping on my coat and dumping cold powder down the back of my neck inside the trees. The world becomes darker and quieter. The snow did not fall very freely there. It collected overhead, muffling everything. My headlamp caught trunks, branches, and drifting flakes, but distance disappears completely. The tracks become harder to follow. The hiker had lost one snowshoe. One side sank deeper than the other. The stride shortened, and the person was tiring. The third impression remained visible besides the trail, though they were different, deeper and wider. Whatever had made them had made the ground heavier. Now, I kept on moving for another 10 minutes before I noticed something that makes me stop. There were no branches broken down the third tracks. Now, the human tracks disturbed the low branches, brushing snow from needles, snapping twigs. Mine do too. But the narrow impressions moved through the same tight space without touching anything above the ground. No snow knocked loose, no brush displaced, just marks smearing beneath untouched, as if whoever or whatever made it was only moving at ground level, as if the marks were not made by something moving at all at the tree level. I turn back, slowly turning my light in the direction that I've come. Now I see my own tracks visible, but the hikers were gone. The third line was not. Behind me, the strange impression had vanished, and then they continued. I remembered standing there with my mouth slightly open, breathing too hard, trying to force my brain to accept that my eyes are showing me this. Snow can fill tracks, wind can erase signs, but only behind me, only the strange ones, not my own, not the hikers. That was when I realized that the forest was not just confusing me, it was choosing me to remain visible. Now, I almost turned back around then. I almost decided to retreat to the bowl and wait for backup, radio or no radio. But somewhere ahead, very faintly, I saw a sign of red through the trees, the missing hiker's jacket. It moved once between the trunks and then disappeared. I shouted again and pushed forward. The spruce opened in a narrow frozen creek bed that I didn't recognize. That was impossible because I knew the drainage routes in that district, and this creek should not have been where it was. Its surface was buried under snow except where black ice was showing through in patches. On the far side, a red shape lay against the bank. It was a jacket, empty, laid out flat. sleeves spread, hood facing uphill. Now there's no blood, no tearing, no signs of struggle. It had been removed and rearranged in the snow as carefully as a glove and bottle. The hiker's remaining tracks led straight to it and then stopped at the hem. Beyond it, there's nothing. No bare footprints, no claw marks, no body, nothing. No bare boot prints either. The third set of impressions continued across the frozen creek and up the opposite bank. I did not follow immediately, but I stood there, listening, trying to decide whether I had crossed from search and rescue into recovery, or from recovery into something that I don't have a word for. The creek bed was quiet, the trees above it leaned inward, their dark branches forming a narrow ceiling. Snow fell through the gaps in the slow drifting sheets, and I felt suddenly aware of how far I am from the trailhead, how weak my radio had become, how little anybody would be able to find their own tracks before they vanished out like the others had. Then I saw light on the far bank. Not a flashlight, not a headlight. A steady yellow glow between the trees. I knew that there was no shelter there, no cabin, no ranger catch, no maintenance shed. The nearest emergency shelter was literally 2 miles west, and I had not gone west. Still, the glow remained warm and soft, the kind of light that promises walls, heat, and another human being there. In winter, the kind of light that is powerful and pulls at you, even though that you know it shouldn't be there. No, I didn't go towards it. I looked at the tracks instead. The strange impressions actually climbed into the bank and headed directly for the glow. That was when the radio came alive on my shoulder. Not a voice, with the emergency tone, 3 bursts, then static, and silence. I grabbed it and called dispatch. No response. I called my backup by team name. Nothing. The radio screen flickered, and the battery indicator dropped from half to almost empty, then jumping back. I shook it like an idiot, as if that would help. The yellow light beyond the creek seems to pulse now slightly as the radio crackled. I made my retreat. That decision may have saved me. Now, I backed away from the jacket, keeping the light on the far bank. The yellow glow stayed there where it was. The strange tracks remained fixated in the snow. Nothing moved. I took 1 step back and then another, then turned just enough to find my own trail. The tracks were there. But, wait. I look again. They're gone. The creek bed behind me was smooth. Now, the path through the spruce was gone too. No broken branches, no disturbed snow, no sign that I'd actually entered from that direction whatsoever. For several seconds, I did not move. I just stared at the blank snow and felt something inside me go very still. I'd been lost before. Every ranger has. Briefly, a wrong turn, a fog bank, a bad bearing. This is different. This was not being lost. This was being removed from the evidence of your own movement. I look at my compass. The needle spun once, slowly, pointing towards the yellow light. I turned away from the light. The needle followed it. No matter what direction I faced, north was the glow. This is when I heard the first bell. It was far off, faint and delicate. One soft chime from somewhere behind the yellow light, then another a few seconds later. It sounded like an animal bell, the kind people attach to dogs or pack straps, but the sound did not echo properly. It came from too many places at once. 1 chime ahead, 1 left and 1 behind me, and then all silence. I shut my compass and gripped my flashlight, and chose a direction that felt downhill. The train is all that I had left, so if I could follow it, hopefully, I might find the drainage that I can recognize. So I stepped carefully onto the ice, crossed away from the jacket, and moved along the creek bed instead of towards the light. The bells start again. Soft, scattered, not following a rhythm. I kept moving. The creek curved between the banks, crowded and covered with roots and snow. The ice beneath me cracked softly in places, and I test every footstep. I don't look back. I did not look towards the light. I focused on the black line of the creek and the shape of the banks, trying to force the world back into geography. After maybe 5 minutes, the light appeared ahead of me again. I stopped so suddenly I almost slipped. There it was, Between the tree on the bank, the same yellow glow, same distance, same height and softness. I'd been moving away from it, downstream, and somehow it's ahead of me. The bells chime once, closer now. I moved faster, the creek narrowed, the branches leaned lower, and snow thickens again, flakes cutting through my light like static. My breathing grows loud, harsh inside my hood. I kept thinking of the jacket laid out in the snow, the empty glove, the missing tracks, the first hiker vanishing in an open bowl. I kept thinking of how everything had been placed and not just dropped, and how weird that was. The creek ended at a frozen pond. It should have not been there. I knew the area. There was no pond below the ridge, but there it was, a flat white clearing, which is bordered by black trees. The ice hidden under snow except for dark patches near the center. On the far side is a row of shapes. At first I think they're people. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, standing just inside the tree line. I raised my lights and breathed slowly, trying to stay calm. But they were not people. They were packs, hiking packs, day packs, old canvas frames, modern nylon bags all hanging from branches at roughly shoulder height. Snow collected on them. Something looks new. Something looks really old, like decades so. Their straps hung down like arms. Beneath each one, something had been placed in the snow. A glove, a hat, a boot, a scarf. One single item per pack, neatly arranged. I did not step onto the pond. I understood then that the missing hikers were not the first. Maybe not even close. The yellow glow appeared again on the opposite side of the pond. Behind the row of hanging packs, brighter now and warmer. I could almost see a shape around it, like a window in a cabin hidden by trees. But there's no cabin, just light. Just a suggestion of shelter. One of the packs swayed, but there was no wind, and then another moved, and another. Not swinging naturally, but turning slightly, as though somebody or something behind them just brushed past. I backed away. A bell chimed right beside my ear. I spun around, and for the first time, I saw it clearly enough that I knew that I could never explain it. A figure stood behind me, maybe 20 feet away, tall, but not tall in a dramatic, monstrous way. Tall like a person, stretched slightly beyond what a person should be. It wore snow ever so strangely, not on its shoulders or head, but through itself, as if flakes passed into the darkness of its shape and then disappeared. It had no face that I could see, no eyes, no mouth, just a hooded outline of a blackness against the white creek with something hanging from one long arm. A bell, a small rusted bell tied with a red cord. It lifted the bell slightly and I ran. I did not think. I didn't choose a direction. I ran along the creek bank, crashing through the snow, slipping on buried stones, branches breaking hard enough to tear a bark loose behind me. But now I hear the bell ring once softly. Same direction, and somehow that quiet sound was worse than any scream could have ever been. It did not sound urgent, it sounded patient. The forest changed as I ran. I know that sounds impossible, but there's no other way to say it. The trees appeared where open space had been. The creek curved too sharply. The slope rose and fell again. My light caught familiar shapes and made them look unfamiliar a second later. I saw the same split trunk 3 times, always on my left, always closer than before. I chose my own tracks once, and then again, though I'd not looped. The snow underfoot alternated between untouched powder and trampled paths full of old impressions that vanish when I try and look directly at them. At some point, I lost the creek. 1 second it was beside me, the next, I climbed through the dense trees with no water, no sound, and no visible bank. The bells were behind me, then above. Not many, just 1 or 2 at a time. Now I can hear soft chimes, behind, then ahead, then above. Not many, just 1 or 2 at a time, soft chimes moving through the snowfall. I forced myself to stop. Running blind into water kills, though. That thought broke through the panic just enough to slow me. I braced one hand against a tree, bent over and tried to breathe. My chest burns, my knee hurt from where I'd slammed into it, and something under the snow. I turned off my headlamp for 1 second, hoping the darkness will reset my vision. The world went black in that darkness, but the yellow shape appeared, not far away, close. Now it's maybe 30 yards through the trees. I turned the lamp back on, the light regained. Now, I was looking at a cabin, a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, warm light in the window, a porch half buried in snow. I knew it was impossible. I knew there was no cabin there, but I also knew that if I had not already seen what I had seen, I might have walked straight towards it. Anybody would. 2 lost hikers, cold, frightened, following a warm light through the snow. Of course they would go in. Of course they would take off gloves, jackets, packs. Of course they would step inside. Now, the cabin door was slightly ajar. Warm orange spilled into the snow. Something dark was moving behind the window, and I backed away slowly. The door opened wider, but nobody came out. I turned and ran again. By this time I ran with purpose, away from the cabin, uphill if possible, towards wind if I could feel it, towards anything that might put me back on the ridge. The bell started behind me again, no louder, no faster, but steady enough to let me know that the thing was following. My radio crackled again. I nearly tear it off my shoulder, getting it into my mouth. A voice came through, broken but real. One of the backup rangers, Mara, was asking for where I was. I shouted into the radio that I'm off trail, disorientated, possibly north of Bowl, following terrain uphill. Static swallows half of it, but she asked me to activate the emergency beacon. I reached for it. It was gone. The clip on my pack was empty. I stopped for a second, patting my chest, my belt, my pocket. Even though I know exactly where it should have been, it was gone, removed. Then I saw it ahead, sitting on a stump in the snow, my beacon, placed upright, light blinking. Besides it was my missing glove. I had not lost a glove. I looked down at my hands. Both gloves are on. The one on the stump was older, torn, with crusted ice, but not mine, but close enough in shape and colour from a distance to resemble my own. Placed beside the beacon. Now I grabbed the beacon and backed away without touching the glove. The moment I lifted it, I can't hear the bells. The silence hits harder than any sound. I activate the beacon and the red light starts blinking steadily against the snow. For the first time in what felt like hours, I had done something real, something connected to the outside world, something that could be tracked. Then the radio comes through again, Mara's voice, closer now, telling me to stay where I am, and I almost did. Then I heard the cabin door creak open behind me, not far away, but behind, and I turned. The cabin was there again, impossible and close, between trees I just passed. The door was open wide now, inside the orange light flickering. On the threshold lay a second snowshoe, one of the missing hikers placed neatly waiting. From inside the cabin came the sound of somebody dragging something across wooden floorboards slowly, heavily. I run uphill, branches slapping my face, snow filling my boots, the beacon flashing in my hand. It felt like a lifeline. The radio burst with static and fragments of voices, Mara calling my name, dispatch asking for coordinates, somebody saying my signal was moving too fast, somebody else telling me to stop. I couldn't stop though, not with the cabin behind me, not with the thing inside, not with the bells and which had suddenly gone silent. I broke through the trees into open ground. The white bowl. I was back. The bowl spread ahead of me under the falling snow, pale and wide, and empty except for lines of tracks I'd followed earlier. My own prints were there now, scattered and confused at the edge. The place where the first hiker's tracks ended was still visible. But now, there was something standing there. Not the black figure. It was one of the hikers. A woman, maybe late 20s, wearing a blue jacket, No gloves, no hat. She stood exactly where the tracks ended, facing far from me. Snow collected on her hair and shoulders. She didn't move. I called her, but she does not turn. I approached slowly, with every instinct screaming at me to stop. Her arms were at her side. Her hands were pale. She was shaking clearly from cold, but she suddenly becomes still. When I got within 10 feet, I saw that snow around her boots were untouched. No tracks leading in, no disturbance. She had simply appeared where the boots ended. I say her name. Her head turned slightly, just enough for me to see the side of her face. Her eyes are open. She whispered something. Not repeated, not mimicking, just one sentence. It hangs where it cannot keep. And then she collapsed. I caught her body before she hits the ground. She was real, solid and freezing. I shouted into the radio, giving my position, telling them that I have one of the subjects alive. This time, the signal went through, and they answer immediately. One of the other rangers is close, maybe 10 minutes away. I wrap the woman in an emergency blanket and check her pulse, breathing and pupils. She was severely hypothermic but alive. She did not respond to questions. Her lips moved once, but no sound comes out. I kept glancing at the bowl, looking for the second hiker, looking for the figure, looking for the cabin light, and there's nothing. Then I suddenly see some more tracks. Finally, the third impressions. They circle the bowl, not leading in, not leading out, but circling. A wide ring around us, just inside the tree line, fresh, complete. I stood over the woman with my flashlight raised, turning slowly. The ring was unbroken. Now at some point, while I'd been standing there, the impressions had appeared around the entire bowl, but I heard nothing. The bell chimed once from the trees, then another from the opposite side, and then a third. I mean, not so many, but just enough to tell me that the ring was not empty, so I drew my flare. Every ranger carries one in winter, not as a weapon, but as a signal and emergency fire source. That night, it was the only thing that I had that felt like it might matter. I struck it, and red light exploded into snow, harsh and bright, staining the bowl like blood. The effect is immediate. The bell stopped. The tree line seemed to pull back. Or maybe the flare just made the shadows appear normal. The woman stirred under the blanket, eyes open, unfocused. She looked past me and whispered, "Don't let it make a place for you," and then passes out again. She looks really out of it. I kept the flare raised until I saw headlamps coming from down the ridge. Mara reaches me first and then Colin behind her. Their arrival broke something in the air. Sound returned all at once. Wind across the bowl, snow hissing over the crust, and radio chatter, human voices. The forest became forest again, and with that, the change came and a lot of relief. We evacuate the woman almost immediately. No one questioned why I was shaken. No one questioned the flare, or the unbroken route, or why my beacon showed a path that looped through the terrain none of us recognize. Search and rescue does not always allow questions in the moment. You get the living out first. Everything else waits. We did not find the second hiker that night. We searched until weather made it impossible. We returned the next morning with more people in daylight, dogs, GPS grids, and everything. We found the line of items I had seen: the glove, bottle, strap, the snowshoe, the jacket, all real, all photographed and logged. We found the hanging packs by the pond too, though no pond appeared on any current map. Some of the packs were recent enough to identify, others were so old that the fabric tore when touched. Inside one, we found a driver's license plate from 1988. Inside another, a roll of film ruined by moisture. Most had no identification at all. We did not find the cabin, not in daylight, not with the GPS or the dogs. No smoke, no structure, no porch, no window, no warm light, just trees and snow where it had been. The rescued hiker survived. She had frostbite in 2 fingers and almost no memory after leaving the ridge. She said her partner had seen a light below the trees and wanted to check it out because they thought it was a ranger shelter. She remembered arguing because it was not on their map. She remembered feeling like she was suddenly warm somehow. She remembered standing on a porch hearing bells inside the walls. Now, after that, nothing, until she woke up much later in hospital. Now, the second hiker was found alive, but 3 days later. This is a part people never expect. He was found near the old service road, almost 4 miles from where the tracks had actually ended. Curled beneath a fallen tree in the survival position, badly hypothermic, but breathing. He was missing his jacket, 1 snowshoe, 1 glove in his pack. He had no memory of how he got there. The last thing he remembered was stepping towards a cabin light and seeing backpackers, or what he thought were, and then realizing there were backpacks hanging from the rafters inside the dripping snow melts onto the floor. He said there was something sitting by the stove. He wouldn't describe it. Whenever somebody asked, he started shaking so hard that the doctor stopped to interview. Officially, this case was written off as disorientation and hypothermia and survival under extreme conditions. The strange tracks were attributed to environmental disorientation and partial melt. The hanging packs were logged as lost property from multiple unrelated incidents. Not the same. The impossible parts don't go to the report, they never do. Because reports are built for things that can be acted on. Now in the following spring, a team went back to recover the old packs and survey the unmapped pond. The pond was there, though smaller than I remembered. The packs were there too. Some had fallen, some hung from branches. Beneath each one, the snow was gone, suddenly replaced by wet black earth. No cabin, no foundation was found, no evidence of structure, no firing, no chimney stones, nothing. Near the pond, one of the surveyors found a rusted bell tied to a branch with a red cord. He cut it down and brought it back. I wish he didn't. The bell sat in the evidence room for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, the cord is found on the floor, cut cleanly, but the bell's gone. The evidence room door had remained locked. No cameras showed anything or anyone entering, but the missing bell was never found. After that, no one argued when the closure became permanent. They removed the trail markers first, and then the old map references. The ridge still exists, of course, you can't remove a ridge, but the northern winter route is gone from public maps now, and if anybody asks, they are told that it was closed because of avalanche risk, unstable snow, and repeated snow search incidents. All of that is true, but just not the whole truth.